All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. Joanna here. Welcome to Why Read, episode 24 with the Library Ladder. I'm very excited for this episode. It is our first Why Read episode of 2024, so Happy New Year to everyone. And on this show, on the Why Read series, we always start with the Why Read question. Sometimes I forget and say, How are you? And I'm not going to do that this time. So, Bridger, why read? And this question is a very broad question, obviously, and you can interpret it any way you want. Some people like to go down the route of how they fell in love with reading, but really it could be why do you feel inspired to pick up a book in this day and age in 2024 when there are so many things competing for your attention? What inspires you to pick up a book?
Well, thanks. Well, first of all, happy 24 and 24. That's a propitious number to start the new year. And I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation and really look forward to our chat today. And welcome to everybody who tuned in. I really, on this StreamYard site that we're doing this through, I can't really see who's here or who's not. So I will try to monitor the chat to the extent that I can, but I'm working off of a really small laptop screen that doesn't allow me to see a whole lot. So if I miss a question from somebody, I apologize. And I'm sure that Joanna and Evie will bring it to my attention if they can. But to your question, why read? Well, because it shapes and defines me. I mean, that's the short answer. There's a much longer answer to that. And I tend to think of reading as a way of extending my own life experience. Exponentially, because, my life experience is limited to what I can do in my own timeline. But when I read books, I'm getting the benefit of other people's experiences, both real and imaginary. Where if it's fiction, there are authors who are creating characters, hopefully at least somewhat realistic characters, so that I can occupy their brain for a little while. I mean, I can see the world through their eyes. I can imagine what kinds of experiences they're having, what kinds of thought processes are they going through to work out whatever problems they're facing, whatever situations they're confronting. How do they find happiness? Is there something that I can learn from that? I love the fact that, I can vicariously live through other people's lives through books. And, I find reading far more effective than other media, whether film or television or graphic novels, manga, whatever. And that's because I think you can get more in depth, you can get more nuanced in the kinds of understanding that you get about characters and about situations that is a lot harder in other media, where in other media you have to make a lot more assumptions a lot of the time, where when you're reading a book, the author has a lot of leeway to spell out in great detail however much they want to give you. And maybe they want to allow you to draw your own inferences and, project your own experiences onto a character. Or maybe they really want you to share what, this creation they've come up with, is experiencing. And I think it's far more effective. And I'm not diminishing film or other media. I think you can gain a lot from those media too. It's just, for me, reading has a much higher degree of impact. And it's the kind of thing that it's never purely a passive activity for me. And I'd say it's never purely a passive activity for anyone. But, it's possible to read just purely for enjoyment. And for me, that gets close to being passive. I read widely. I read a lot of different things. I read, absolute garbage on occasion, because it's I can turn off my brain a lot of times for those types of books. I can just enjoy the ridiculousness of it for the sake of it being ridiculous. Or, there are nostalgia reads, things that I enjoyed as a kid that sometimes I'll go back and I want to revisit it. Rereading it as an adult does change the experience for me sometimes. Sometimes I'm able to recapture, oh, I remember how I felt when I read this. Other times it's like, I can see why I really liked this at the age of 12, but I can also see why it's not the same experience now as I'm approaching retirement age. My perspective is different, but also my appreciation of storytelling is different, and how authors write stories. And for the audiences that they're writing, they're going to tailor it a little differently. But I still like reading a lot of those old stories because I can turn off the active reader part of my brain. As I've gotten more experienced as a reader, as I've gotten older and read far more than I did as a youngster, as I said before, I'm using this to kind of broaden my own perspective and my own life experience. But that also means kind of interrogating the author, interrogating the book that they've created, interrogating the characters and the situations to see, is this something that's worth learning from? Or is it so unrealistic that I'm actually going to take bad lessons away from it because the logic underlying whatever the characters are doing makes no sense? So why would I want to learn from illogical kinds of situations or behaviors? And so I'm naturally pretty analytical, just the way I am. So I have an inherent tendency to, as I said, interrogate books. But there are books that I like to just pretty passively absorb, enjoy, let it wash over me, let it recreate old experiences, or just go, wow, that was so fun. It was so utterly ridiculous, but I had a good time reading it. And then there are other things where I want to get into it for the intellectual stimulation, for the the intricate plot construction, or the sympathetic or charismatic characters, the emotional catharsis. I mean, reading for me delivers each of those things, as it does for everybody to varying degrees. So I know I'm not saying anything that's particularly unique. Probably most of your guests on the 23 previous episodes of this have said very similar things, I'm guessing. But I read for different reasons, and over the course of my life, those reasons have changed. They've evolved, and I guess it's the kind of thing where, as a youngster, I was reading primarily for plot, but that's because I didn't have much experience, either as a reader, reading widely, but also just life experience. So seeing all of these different experiences that people had, the plot types of things, the situations they encountered, was great. And I was a sponge, just soaking it all up. And likewise with characters, as you experience different types of characters for the first time, for me at least, and I suspect it's true for most readers, or at least many, at their first encounter, they're absorbing it. They're going, hey, this is something new. I want to kind of file this away for future reference, but they're not necessarily really thinking seriously about the characters. They're not comparing the characters to others that they've encountered previously in other books. Likewise, world building. When you encounter new settings in books, the first time I hit settings, it's like, wow, this is just so new. This is so different. When I was reading lots of science fiction and fantasy as a youth and as a teenager, all of those settings were new. Everything was new. There was this sense of wonder and creativity that sparked in me. I just, wow, I wish I could someday create something like this. As I got older, as I read more, and as I started to realize, oh, there are patterns here. Authors aren't necessarily creating original plots. They're actually recycling a lot of well-worn plots, adding little wrinkles here and there. Likewise, character types. You have archetypes for certain types of characters that fit certain roles with different variations, different twists. But you start to see these patterns, and you start to see it also with the world building. Oh, okay, well, I've sort of seen this before. And over time, well, you read something, that really seemed an awful lot like something I read before. And the novelty starts to wear off. And at that point, you start to go, I want to read something new. I want to read something different. I want to read something that's going to make me experience that sense of wonder and novelty that I used to get from what I was reading when I first started. And so I do that a lot now. I still read for plot. I still read for other things at different times, but I have to admit, I am more drawn to things that, for me at least, are new, things that are creative, things that are thought-provoking, things that force me to look at the world in a different way than I had previously. And so in that way, it's, I hope, making me a better person, a more well-rounded person. And that's a very long-winded answer. I didn't even let
That's a
you get in
great
a word or
answer.
two edgewise in 10 minutes. But I can continue if you like.
Well, I do have some follow-up questions from that because I really
Oh,
love hearing what you shared and about how you like to interrogate authors. I find that so interesting because I think so a few things with that. One is I'm wondering, do you write or has your journey with reading inspired you to become a writer?
I am a writer.
You
I just
are a
don't write
writer.
fiction. I'm not a fiction writer.
Ah, okay.
Uh, I have been writing professionally for a long time, pretty much my entire career. And it was one of the things that really opened some doors for me at times. Um, and at the same time, also caused my parents, I think, a great deal of heartburn and anxiety. Uh, because when I was in college, and even before college, when I was in high school, I was very, very science focused. I was going to be a scientist or something along those lines. When I got to college, I was double majoring in engineering and pre-med. And, the plan was, go to medical school, but do something important in this, the science fields, or the engineering fields along those lines. And I was very, very, well, I had tunnel vision at that point. I loved what I was doing. I loved science. I still do really enjoy it. And I've had just about every science and math under the sun at this point, or at least I did long ago. But about maybe 2 years into my undergraduate studies, I got very frustrated because I had friends in school who were studying things that seemed really interesting. And when you're in a double major engineering pre-med, there are no electives. There is no room in your curriculum to be able to take a history class or a foreign language class or economics or any of these things that other people were taking, and they were talking to me about them. I went, well, I'd really like to learn about that. Why am I stuck taking all of these engineering classes when I'd really like to learn all of this other stuff too? And I had a bit of an epiphany. My parents might have characterized it as a mental breakdown at the time, but I basically reached the conclusion that what was really important to me as a, coming out of college, what I wanted to accomplish as a college graduate was to have a core set of skills that would be useful for the rest of my life. It wasn't about acquiring knowledge. I figured I can acquire knowledge at any point in my life. It's the question of how do you use that knowledge? What skills are necessary to put that knowledge to good use? That's what I want to make sure that I'm really focused on. And so I changed majors. I changed from obviously very STEM focused to a focus on 3 core skills that I identified as the ones that I really wanted to make sure that I had. First set of skills were analytical, but I figured I've got that covered. I've got math and science under my belt. The analytical, critical thinking types of skills I felt pretty comfortable with already. So I said, well, what else is there? I said, well, there's human relation skills, the ability to understand people, to be able to relate to people, to interact with them and work collaboratively with them. We live in a social world, and it's difficult to accomplish much, all by yourself. And for me, this was a bit of a revelation for me, because up to that point, my entire life, I was self-sufficient in the sense that my parents taught me to be self-sufficient and to teach myself skills. If I wanted to learn something, well, I'd go out and I'd learn it. And I was very much a do-it-yourselfer. And I realized that while that is really good a lot of the times, it is self-defeating in other situations. So I said, I want to make sure that I understand people well. And then the third core skill was communication. And I said, those other 2 skills are basically worthless if you can't communicate effectively. You can have the best critical thinking, analytical approach to something, but if you can't convince people that your approach is the correct one, it's kind of pointless. You really need to be able to communicate effectively. And so I switched majors. I switched to major in journalism and
A dramatic
minored in,
change.
yes, and with a minor in psychology. So I tackled that. And like I said, my parents were having a heart attack at the time. But I said, don't worry, Mom, Dad, it's going to be fine. Trust me. I know what I'm doing. I'm 20 years old. Or actually, I don't think I was 20 years old. I think I was 19 at the time, or something like that. So I'm wise enough to know what's best for me. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it actually did work out, and I'm very glad I did it that way, and it has served me very, very well since then, because it did equip me with a set of skills that have allowed me to do a lot of the things that I've enjoyed doing professionally. But I am a writer as part of my job. I have been everything from a professional diplomat, literally working overseas, where a big part of my job was figuring out how to communicate very technical policy information, analytical information, economic information for audiences who didn't speak English as their native language, and who in many cases were laypersons, and that they weren't subject matter experts. So trying to communicate clearly and effectively to those kinds of audiences was a real challenge. And that was my first job out of college, in fact, was working for the World Bank, doing a lot of overseas work, economic development work, a lot of it in the social sectors. I did a lot of education reform work, a lot of healthcare, a lot of poverty alleviation work in a number of developing countries. But working in that environment around people from all over the world, different cultures, different languages that were their native languages, really taught me a lot about how to use those skills, the human relation skills, the communication skills, effectively. And from then I've had a number of other careers that it's been useful for. Again, a very long-winded answer.
But I
Cut me off
think
if I'm running too long.
well, I was going to
And
say that those three
please,
skills
in the
also
comments, if I'm going too long, shout it out.
I was going to say though that those three skills also, I think, served your channel very well. Serve what you do in your channel because you do offer great communication skills regarding the works that you've analyzed. So I think, and your videos are very educational as well. Yeah, the reason I asked if you were a writer, though, and that's very fair to say that you're a writer, just not a fiction, is that
Right.
often heard that a lot of writers have difficulty reading books because their analytical mind goes off too much about the writing itself, the interrogating the author type of thing. And I recently heard Jenny Wirtz say that that's a myth or that that goes away with time, that you can eventually read books for fun, even if you're not thinking in that critical mode. So
I completely
that
agree with that. I can
mhm.
turn it off. It's just I default to that mode. But if it's a book that I know going in that it's pointless for me to do that, then I don't. I just say I'm going to enjoy this for what it is at a very basic level and not really think about all of the other aspects of it. But on the other hand, if it's a book that is new to me, an author that's new to me, or a book that I know has the potential to offer a challenge or a different perspective on things, then I want to have that kind of analytical mode on. And I really enjoy that.
Yes, I agree with that too. And it's also funny because I was just visiting my mother and she gave me this story as well because she got her degree in English literature. And
Mhm.
I mean, she got her degree back in like this, I think the 60s. And I don't know if education was different back then, but I feel as though my mother has insights into literary techniques that I haven't heard many people have, even at the PhD level these days, as she's very smart. But she said that one time she was in a book club and reading a book for fun, and afterwards she was talking to somebody else who I think was a lawyer or something, and she was talking about all the different techniques she noticed the author using. And she went on for probably like 20 minutes because my mother can talk. And afterwards, the person said, I just read the book. And she realized it humbled her. And she realized, oh, wow, you don't have to be analytical all the time about what you're reading. But honestly, I love that about my mother. I wish I could analyze literature on the level that she does.
Well, I've been trained to be very analytical. I mean, I have been analytical since I was very young, but I just in school, I've pursued a lot of additional degrees over the years, and they all involved a lot of analytics. And so I went to business school. I went to law school. I went to graduate school for a PhD. I actually taught, uh, data analytics, advanced statistics, econometrics to graduate students in graduate school. It's kind of innate in me, but I like to give it a rest at times, and so uh, that is it's a nice respite for me when I can just read something that doesn't involve analyzing things.
I think that has a place too, though. It really does. And you were talking about the importance of finding works that give you a sense of novelty and wonder. And I wanted to ask you about that too, because I noticed, I think on Chatting with Nuts in your conversation with Jimmy, you were talking about how much you reread books these days, especially for the content on your channel. And I was curious about that if there because it seems as though your channel is a wonderful resource for people who are interested in learning the roots of the genre, finding out what authors inspired certain aspects of the fantasy genre or sci-fi genre or various genres in general. Now, I was curious if there have been any modern authors in either fantasy or sci-fi that have given you novelty and wonder in recent years.
Yes.
And which
And
ones?
some
What do you
that have given
highlight?
me the opposite, actually. Although I've been a little bit frustrated over the last couple of years because I haven't read very much that's really recent because of my channel. And uh, I I mean, it's part of just the nature of my channel. I made a conscious decision when I started my channel that I wanted to focus on books that were not being discussed widely on BookTube. You know, I do read, I do enjoy modern fantasy and science fiction, but I think there are a lot of other channels that are covering it in depth. You know, there's lots of discussion out there. I want to be able to add something new to the discussion, and I don't know that I'd add all that much value to a well-established discussion.
I bet we'd all
So
disagree with that, but okay. Go ahead.
I,
Sorry.
I'm looking for niches where I can fill gaps. You know, that there are gaps in the coverage of BookTube, enormous gaps. And you know, I thought I can do more for BookTube by trying to fill in those gaps and focusing to a large extent on older works. Although there are works that are just, you know, 15, 20 years old, that's not that old, that get very little attention on BookTube. And I do occasionally try to focus on them, and I will be focusing on some of those actually very soon. And you know, one of my upcoming videos is going to focus on an author who's still writing today, but has had a long career. And I really enjoy her works. That's Connie Willis. So I'm going to do a retrospective of hers.
I'm
And
very
so I'm in the
excited to hear
process
that.
right now of I'm doing a reread of all of her works and filling in a couple of my own gaps where I hadn't read everything by her, but I'd read almost everything. But I'm making a point to say, okay, if I'm going to talk about her as a retrospective, I'm going to do my very best to read everything that I can, so I can put her in context. You know, that, you know, when I compare her works and say, you know, these are the ones that I think I really enjoyed the most, I can give a good, meaningful comparison across all of them, and hopefully viewers think that that's useful. But I also want to talk about books from the standpoint of a relatively fresh memory, because a lot of these books that I talk about on my channel, you know, I first read them 40 years ago or more, and some of them, and then I've reread some of them over the years, but you know, some of these books, the last time I read them was 20, 25, 30 years ago. I remember general things about them, but I really don't feel comfortable going into depth about the books because my memory's fuzzy at this point. You know, I remember more the emotional impact it might have had on me, or the intellectual impact, like, you know, oh, this really broadened my perspective on something. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I remember exactly how it broadened my perspective. I
Mhm.
just remember in a general sense that it did. So I've been doing a lot of rereads to refresh all of those connections in my brain so that I can, you know, hopefully convey it reasonably effectively to
Absolutely.
the audience. But some of these rereads have gotten, uh, well, pretty exhaustive. I think when I was on Jimmy's show back in June, I was in the middle of a reread of Jack Vance because I'm working on a retrospective of Jack Vance, and Jack Vance wrote voluminously, and I still haven't finished that reread.
No.
I mean, I'm almost finished, but I've been putting off that video because I'm not ready to make it yet. But the thing is all of these rereads crowd out newer works. And I don't know, 15 years ago or so, you know, sometime around then, I did make a decision to stop reading brand new works for the most part. I mean, I generally wait 3 to 4 years before I will, after a work is published, before I'll read it. I am somewhat skeptical of a lot of the hype that tends to surround new releases, that there's, the publishers and the authors, they have an incentive to make these books out to be the best thing ever, that this is, one of these, you must read it. There's nothing been like it in the history of literature, or, whatever genre it might be in. And, I've bought into that hype before and been disappointed a lot of the time, because it just didn't measure up. And as I'm getting older and realizing, my opportunity to read is getting shorter as my life expectancy is getting shorter. So the opportunity cost of reading books that ultimately dissatisfy me is getting a little high. So I said, there are so many books that I have not yet read. I'm perfectly happy waiting 3 or 4 years to pick up, a recent book, after it's had a chance to actually percolate through the community, where reviews will start to trickle in that provide maybe a more balanced view of the book, different kinds of experiences with it, where I can look, read some of those reviews, and I hopefully spoiler-free reviews, because I absolutely do not like spoilers. But if they've done their reviews well, they can give me a sense of whether I would probably enjoy reading it or not, or whether it's potentially challenging enough that even if I ultimately don't like it, I'll be glad after I've read it, that I'm glad I read that. I learned something from that experience, even if I didn't particularly enjoy the book. I did take a break back in September, I guess it was September, October timeframe this year, where I just said, okay, I've been doing too much rereading. I mean, I need to start catching up on other books, the things that I've been putting off. And so I there were a few books that had come out in recent years that had gotten a lot of publicity, and there was a pretty strong amount of positive word of mouth, both on BookTube or on GoodReads and others. I thought, yeah, I'd like to try these. I read Richard Swann's Justice of Kings. I thought, I love fantasy, I love mysteries. This combines the two of them. Sounds like a good combination. I wanted to give that a try. I started Fonda Lee's Jade trilogy, so I read Jade City. I read Christopher Rocchio's Empire of Silence, because Sun Eater is getting rave reviews, and
it's getting a lot of attention right now.
I, wanted to see, is this something that do I agree with these reviews or not? I mean, and how do I react to these things? How do I calibrate my own experiences with books for viewers who are experiencing books maybe a little differently than I am, perhaps? I took Alan's recommendation to read K.J. Parker, and I did. I read the first book in his Siege trilogy, the 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. And I'm actually I'm in the final part of reading Simon Jimenez's The Spear Cuts Through Water right now, which also Evie had been pushing very, very hard on Jimmy's Discord. And I said, I'm going to try this. And I'm glad. So yes.
Oh, because that's actually going to be the next book I read. Honestly, I'm starting that tomorrow.
I'm like 80%, 80 to 85% of the way finished with it. And it's a challenging read, and I have to say I'm listening to it on audiobook, which makes it more challenging. I would actually recommend, if you're going to read it in hard copy or ebook or something. The narrator does a fine job. It's just the structure of the story and the different first, second, and third point of view, person perspective narration the story is just structured on so many different levels that audiobook requires a much more active level of listening than sometimes I'm capable of providing, just because of what I'm doing when I'm listening to audiobooks. So it has been a little bit challenging, very rewarding. I have enjoyed it. So Evie, thumbs up for
Yay,
The Spirit Comes from
Evie.
Water.
So that was probably the
Uh,
most was that like the most positive experience you think you've had with recent
no,
authors?
KJ Parker's was great. I quite enjoyed it.
That would make Alan
I,
very happy.
I mean, I actually, one of the other ones I attempted, but again, this was also on audio, was R. Scott Baker's The Darkness That Comes Before.
Ah, yes.
I have no opinion of it at the moment. I got about maybe 20% of the way into it listening, and I had to stop. It required
Mhm.
too much focus. The names were too difficult to keep track of. The places, I mean, everything was, it needed a visual component for
I
me.
did like, when I read that book, I did scroll back to because the appendices has a really detailed map and, it has some other information in the back as well, so I remember when I read that book, at least for the first quarter, I did flip back and forth quite a bit,
Yeah.
and then after a while, you get into the flow of things, and it's not hard to follow, but I do
Yes,
recommend a physical copy
I
for
want to
that.
go back to it. I just, I don't recommend it on audio. And again, it has
Me.
nothing to do with the performance of the narrator. It's just the nature of the book itself is difficult. And I think, for me at least, the reading experience would be much more rewarding with a hard copy, or at least a visually reading it. Coming up on my TBR list, I am going to start Ada Palmer. Uh, I want to get to Like the Lightning, and that's been sitting on my shelves for a while. And I've loved hearing some of the comparisons that it has gotten to some other highly regarded um, works that, that I really like and respect. So I'm eager to try that one out. But
Ah,
you're right. There are some of the books that I've read, some of the recent books have not lived up to expectations, and it has disappointed me.
yeah.
So
Well, I have the
I
very unpopular opinion of not I did not personally, get into Jade City. I read that, back in 2020, and it just wasn't for me. I'm probably the only person on BookTube who feels that way, but
no, there's two. You're talking to one of them.
yay, I'm not alone. But I did go through a period, especially around that time, where I was picking up a lot of new releases, and every single one of them just wasn't doing it for me for whatever reason. And actually, after that, I made a point of not reading a lot of new releases until they were out for a while and I could make a better decision about whether the book would be for me. So I could actually do something similar, even though there are still some books I make exceptions for. Um, but for the most part, I do feel like I need some time, I need some distance to know for sure. And I also feel guilty whenever I'm personally responsible for causing hype over a book. I try really hard to be careful about that, and I find this happens all the time where I'll talk excitedly about a book, and then somebody will say, "Oh, I'm gonna pick up that book," and then I say, "Oh, no, I don't think that would be for you." Because I am very particular in thinking of the type of people who might appreciate for a certain book, and it can be challenging sometimes when you're talking to a wide audience, to give those the level of thought or the level of detail that makes it clear who the intended reader is. I try really hard to do that, but I still feel like I fall short sometimes.
I understand what you're saying, because I have similar thoughts with my own channel, my own content that I make, because my content really is focused on promoting books and authors that I want people to read, or at least I want them to explore that, to investigate whether those books and authors are something that would appeal to them, because in many cases they might not even be aware of those authors, or they might have heard of them briefly in passing, or maybe one of or two of their books, but not any of these others. And so all I want to do is put it on their radar so that they have maybe a little better understanding. But what I don't want people to do is to take my 3-minute summary of a book or an author and then go, oh, I'm going to go buy that book and all of the others that he talked about. And suddenly their TBR is miles long and their credit card bill is going through the roof. And it's like, no, no, I'm not actually, I don't actually want you to go out and buy all of these books, but I do want you to start, exploring them a little bit, do a little research on the author, look at their Goodreads pages or look at, see if there are other reviews that are out there that can help you understand a little bit more. Don't just take my word for something and act on it. Please don't. I don't want that level of responsibility or,
Yes.
disappointment that you might have. Like, I spent all this money on these books. I mean, his taste is terrible.
I
He's
know.
recommending all of these books. And like, no, 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 no. Make your own decision, but base it on more than just my brief description of something, because I'm, for me, it's always a challenge on my videos to figure out what's the sweet spot for the amount of detail that I want to put in there. And, as you can tell from just me chatting this afternoon, I can go on and on and on and on and on and on. And I don't really want to bore audiences with
I do want to
too
share
much.
with you, though, that I have 2 books here that I picked up that you recommended on your channel. One, I didn't realize you had done a video on, but I was doing a little bit of used book shopping when I was visiting
Mhm.
family for the holidays in New Mexico, because I don't have a good used bookshop where I live. It is the saddest thing. So I was so excited going through used bookshops there. And I found this book and I picked it up, I'll be honest, thanks to John from Talking Story, who was in this
Okay.
video that you and I were in on Josh's channel on Red Fairy Books about underhyped or underappreciated
Right.
authors or books. And he recommended this book,
Oh, the sparrow.
The Sparrow. Yes. And then I saw you had a video on this, and I didn't realize it was a duology. But I
Yeah,
realized from the premise that this sounds like such a fascinating book, and your video
it
got me
is.
even more excited.
And I highly recommend reading it as a duology. It is most often presented as a standalone. There's a lot of discussion about the sparrow. It's only one half of the story, and in my opinion, it's the lesser half of the story. I actually like the second book better, but the second book, I think, really closes the circle of the overall story that the author was trying to tell. And you know, again, don't go out and buy the second book. I mean, if you already have the Sparrow and you want to read it, but don't finish the Sparrow and then say, okay, that's all I need to read. And if you dislike the Sparrow, which many people do, it's a polarizing book, and there are some aspects of it that are tough. They're difficult to swallow. The second book takes some of that darkness and puts it into a more positive light and in a different context. And so even if you have a negative response to the Sparrow, the second book might actually be a much more positive experience for you as a reader, which is why I really think the two of them should be read in tandem.
Well, I spent $7 on it. It was a used copy, so I don't feel like that was a lot of money for a hardback
No.
edition. And I look forward to
Hardback
getting
first
to.
edition, that is it a library, ex-library or not?
Oh, I don't think it's an ex-library edition. I don't.
Well,
It's.
then you
I'm not
got a
sure.
bargain at
I did.
$7. That
Yeah.
is a bargain.
Yay! Hooray for the used
Yeah,
bookstore.
those editions. Assuming, I mean, it looks like it's in pretty good shape.
It is. It's in very good shape.
Yeah, it looks that way. I mean, that's probably a $40 value at least.
Okay, it does have a little bit
My
of highlighting in it. It does have a little tiny bit of highlighting in it, but I'm still happy to have it, and I'm looking forward to getting to it. It looks like Jimmy's going to be getting to it too, so maybe I could chat with him about it when I get to it. Another book I picked up based on your recommendation, and this has to do with a video that you did on books for kids, fantasy for kids, which is a topic I'm especially curious about. I
Okay.
had to pick this up as soon as I saw it, though I regret it's the second in the series, and that is The Black Cauldron by Lloyd Alexander. So this is book 2 in the Prydain series. And when I heard you talk about this series, I instantly wanted to buy the whole entire set, which I might do. But then I found this for how much did I pay? Like $1, not even $1. I paid not even $1 for this. So
Yeah.
I just went ahead and
Well,
got it.
it, yeah, that's all, but that's the second book in the series. You
Yes.
need to read the first one,
Yes, I
and
do.
so
And they didn't have it. And I checked 2 bookstores, and neither one had any of the other books in the series. So I just went ahead and got this for now, but I will go and get the first book in the series. And maybe I
it
might
is a
even try this on audio, honestly, since I might be able to follow it on audio, I think.
oh,
So,
completely. It is. In fact, before I made that video for kids books, and I should say that Lloyd Alexander series, the Prydain series, yes, it was written for children. It is very readable for adults. I mean, it is enjoyable for adults. It's not as um, you know uh, complex or quite as dark and violent as you would find in a adult fantasy series, but it does have its dark moments, and it does have a lot of depth to it over the course of the 5 books, and it's told well. I mean, it's just a fun read. And so in making that video, I said, well, it had been probably 30 years since I had actually read the books the last time. So I said, okay, I need to reread them again. But I was in a hurry, so I listened to them on audio.
and I just want to
Audio,
answer
audio
this
was great.
question really
Hmm.
quickly that yes, there was a Disney film that this was based on. And
Yeah.
that's the Disney cover. I'm sorry, I can't get the camera to
Yeah.
if I can get the
The,
camera to
the,
focus on
the,
it.
the Disney film is an abomination. And I,
Oh, no.
with respect to the source material, the Disney film is a mashup of the first 2 books in the 5-book series, and it makes all kinds of changes, and the characterization is wrong. I mean, there's so many things that are just wrong about that Disney film as compared to the source material. I'm not saying that the Disney film is not entertaining, or it's just, don't use the Disney film as a measuring stick at all for the books. They're very different.
Yeah. I never watched the Disney film, which is wild to me because I grew up really into The Sword and the Stone. I would actually say The Sword and the Stone, Disney Sword and the Stone. I hope that you don't cringe too much at this, Bridger, but that was my favorite movie growing up, and it's still a favorite. I love that movie. I love that movie so much. I could practically quote the entire movie,
Well,
Madam
that's very
Mim
funny
song
you
and
say
all.
that, because the video that I am working on right now, that has been
No.
taking me far too long, but I am working on it. I am working on it. Is an overview of Arthurian sagas,
Yay.
which includes The Sword and the Stone, as well as a couple dozen others. And so I've been having a lot of fun exploring some of the historical significance, the kind of the evolution of the story, and how it was used for very specific political and social purposes, to change the existing political order or social order over the course of a millennia. And you know, what we think of today is, sometimes we think, well, it's really trite, it's really cliched, it's so well known. But in many respects, the Arthurian saga is like the extended universe, or the what's the expanded universe, the Star Wars expanded universe, where it was a playground, or a sandbox for lots of different authors to play around with, and they could take pieces from here and pieces from there and create new characters and create entirely new um, conflicts and scenes, and write their own stories that incorporated Arthurian elements. And so the diversity of stories that you can find within that broader Arthurian universe is really remarkable. And there have been some very good adaptations, I think, in the last well, several decades. I mean, there's some very good ones that go back all the way to the 1950s, early 60s, that really have shaped, um, or reshaped, I should say, really not have reshaped how we think of Arthurian epics, so that it's, you can look at it from a historical perspective, you can look at it from a more fantasy perspective, and there are some that are in between, and it's a lot of fun. But I don't necessarily really want to spoil that
Oh, I'm excited to watch it.
upcoming
I'm excited
video,
to watch
but
it.
I'm having fun with it.
That is
And
a huge
oh,
gap in my reading. I do need to read the actual Sword in the Stone. Is it White? Is that the author
yeah,
who wrote that?
yep, T.H.
And
White.
then yeah, T.H. White. And then I did, let's see, I have not read The Crystal Cave yet, which I know is a very famous one. I did read Le Morte d'Arthur in high school, but I don't really remember it, honestly, because it's been a while.
Not one that I would recommend. I mean, simply because it Le Morte d'Arthur has been adapted by other authors over the years directly. I mean, just they took it and said, well, the language here could be told a little better. It's like, well, I'm going to rewrite Chaucer, because reading Chaucer can be a little bit tough. And so modern authors have said, I'm gonna rewrite this, but I'm gonna tell it in modern English and with, sort of modern narrative conventions. And, to Evie's question, yes, Steinbeck wrote one of the what is considered by many to be one of the better adaptations of it. Alas, it was unfinished. He died before he could finish it, but there's a lot of it that he wrote, but he wrote a very faithful adaptation of the traditional story from the late Middle Ages, and so that's one that I am going to be talking about, and as well as some of the ones that you mentioned. Crystal Cave is fantastic. There's Rosemary Sutcliffe wrote Sword at Sunset back around 1960. That was the first modern historical adaptation of Arthur's tale, where it really was trying to approach it from, what if this was actually real? What if there really was an Arthur who, lived sort of at the tail end of the Roman Empire's occupation of Britain, or shortly after the Romans withdrew from Britain? And what would that look like? And that inspired several other more historically focused retellings. Probably the best known today is Bernard Cornwell's
I loved
Warlord
that trilogy.
Chronicles.
I did read that and
But
loved it.
there are others, like another White, Jack White, only spelled Whyte, has a 10-volume, I think, series that is, let's see, how can I, it's as if Ayn Rand wrote a historical retelling of Arthur. And I don't mean that as a pejorative Ayn Rand. It's not extreme libertarianism or anything. I mean, but it definitely is viewing Arthur and the history through a lens that is almost historical, but at the same time slightly ahistorical, because it's putting this filter over it that, what if this John Galtian libertarian utopia actually existed and that was Camelot? I'm grossly exaggerating my characterization there. And for those of you in the audience who are like, man, I hate Ayn Rand and I don't believe at all in her philosophy, you should still read Jack White's version of it, because it's very, very mild in the libertarian leanings that are in there. It's much better. I mean, it's really just a story that is being told, and it's a lot of fun. It does have its flaws, but anyway, so much about Arthur.
It was kind of neat because the used bookstore that I was in, when I was visiting family, they actually had a whole section in the fantasy section, a subsection in the fantasy section based on Arthurian fantasy, which was interesting. So there were probably some titles there that you know of that I wouldn't have known of. So, question for you: are you including The Buried Giant by
I
Cause?
I I am not an actual discussion of it. I am going to highlight sort of works, modern works that have a tangential connection to the Arthurian uh, story. I mean, things like Guy Gavriel Kay's Fiona of Our Tapestry, which isn't about the Arthurian saga, but at the same time, there is a subplot involving, a couple of the characters, including Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot. I mean, they are in the Fiona of Our Tapestry and do feature prominently, but it's not really an Arthurian tale.
Ah,
So those types of books are examples of how the Arthur legend has just continued to evolve and provide good fodder for authors to expand and extend the story. So I think those are just some of many examples.
yeah. Well,
Oh
I have
yes,
to.
Monty Python, great example as well. I,
Ah,
I will probably have clips of the Monty Python and the Holy Grail on
so
my video at
yes,
some point.
I grew up with that movie too. So fun. Um, so you mentioned Guy Gavriel Kay, and I have to say
Mhm.
that it is actually by complete coincidence that I'm having the library ladder here on my channel the day after I posted my top 10 reads of 2023. And spoiler for that video, but Guy Gavriel Kay kind of won my year.
Number one, I did see
Number
that.
one,
Uh,
yes.
I was so
And
happy to see that. It
spoiled
is
in the
such a
thumbnail too.
great, great story. I really, really love that. But then again, I love all of Guy Gavriel Kay's works, even the ones that I don't think as highly of. I still think they're very good. I mean, I have never had a bad experience reading one of his books.
Yes. I mean, I've only read 2, but I was so impressed with so many details in his works. I feel I feel a little sad that I'm finding Guy Gavriel Kay so late in life, and at the same time, I feel like his works, um, they feel like they're written for adults in my mind. Not necessarily in the sense that I think a lot of times people think of adult fantasy and they think of gratuitous sex and violence, and that's not what I mean at all. I mean by the themes and by the character perspectives, and that's something that I know in both discussions I had on Guy Gavriel Kay here on the channel that we talked about, because a lot of times when you have that found family element in fantasy, usually you're following younger characters in their formative years when they're learning those relationships or finding those friendships that are long lasting. But Kay has a way of writing adult perspectives in such a believable, excellent way, in my opinion, and also friendships in adulthood. I find that also fascinating about his books is how he does that. Um, yes, and I also have to, of course, credit Jake Bishop. And actually, Jake Bishop was the way I found out about your channel, Bridger, because I know he was talking about Guy Gavriel Kay and mentioned your channel.
Well, Jake was one of the first watchers of my channel, and through the my K video, and Jake posted several really nice comments on the couple of GGK videos that I made. So I very much appreciated getting his feedback, and uh, greatly appreciated the love that he has for GGK. That I wasn't the only voice in the wilderness crying out there. That Jake was too. So there were two of us out there singing Kay's praises.
And people
I,
listened. That's the wonderful thing, is that people have been listening, and now you have a whole bunch of Guy Gavriel Kay fans that are emerging.
I love that, and I have to say, the first time I encountered Kay's works, I bounced off of them. I mean, this was when I was much younger, and I mean, I was an adult, but I was a youngish adult, and the themes and the emotional complexity and the other aspects that make for me, make Kay so rewarding didn't resonate with me the way
I
they
can
do now.
understand that. I can
I,
understand that. I really, like I said, that's exactly what I mean. But I feel like
Mhm.
his books feel written for adults and not, and it's hard to say that without it sounding gatekeep, like I'm talking like a gatekeeper, and I don't mean it to sound that way. I just feel like the complexity, like you say, and the nuance of the characters and the relationships, they speak to me as an older adult in a way that I just don't think they would have spoken to me or I would have related as much as a younger, even in my 20s. I don't think I would have related to them the same way.
Right. And that was me. I was in my 20s when I first started reading Kay, and it wasn't until I was probably about 10 years older that I went back to him and said, okay, I'm going to give this another try. And that's when I went, oh, this is what I've been missing out on. I mean, it was such a rewarding experience when I went back, because I think the first book, I actually think on my when I came back, because I started off with Fiona Var and Tigana the first time I tried reading it, and they didn't resonate with me. I just said maybe another time, but I over the years I kept hearing, oh, you've got to read Kay, and this is so good, and I thought, okay, maybe I missed something. So when I came back to it, I started with The Lines of Our Son, and after I finished that, I went, wow, I want to read more of this. This was absolutely incredible. And uh, then I went on to Song for Our Bond, I think was the second one. I bounced off of A Song for Our Bond. I didn't get more than about 30 pages in. And I thought, something's not working right here. But I didn't give up. I switched to the Sarantine Mosaic, read that. It was like, okay, this is back to great form. This is something that I really, really, really loved. Then started reading some of his others to kind of fill in the gaps for what he had written up to that point. And then I went back to A Song for Our Bond. And this time it hit. I mean, it clicked just right. And it is absolutely one of my favorites of Kay, even though it didn't click the first time I tried. But when I went back to it, whatever it was, just maybe the way I was thinking about how Kay writes, maybe I was just in the wrong mood when I first tried it. I don't know, whatever it was, it resolved itself. And I hope he has many more books left in him, because I'm
Yes.
looking forward to continuing to read his.
I hope so too. I'm excited because obviously I have a long way to go in reading more of his books, and I do hope I get to the Sarantine Mosaic this year. I am planning to read Tigana in April with Josh from Red Fairy Books and Laura from Fantasy Awash, that same K group again, and I also just keep hearing so many people say that their favorite book of last year was Under Heaven. So Under Heaven has been having a renaissance lately. People
It
are loving that book.
it is a beautiful book. I tier ranked his books in one of my videos, and my absolute masterpiece tier, uh, which was really hard to, virtually impossible to rank within the tier, because they're all so very, very good, but for slightly different reasons. You had Lines of Our Son, the Sarantine Mosaic, uh, Song for a Bond, and Under Heaven. I mean, for me, those are the four absolute pinnacles for Kay. But others, might put Tigana up there, or they might put A Brightness Long Ago in that very, very top tier. People's reactions to his books are going to change. Those just happen to be the ones that I could find very, very little fault in when I read them. It was just, so they were so well researched. So the analytical side of me was going, hey, I'm actually learning history here, even though it's not real history. It's still sufficiently inspired by history that I know that I'm absorbing some degree of actual useful information from a historical perspective. And I love your going back to your point of certain books hit us in different ways at different times in our lives. And one of the books that I did read recently that I'd never read it before, but it was getting a ton of coverage on BookTube, was Stoner. And probably the audience is going, "Oh, are we going to hear about Stoner again? Because boy, everybody talks about Stoner." But,
Hey, I'm like the Stoner girl. That was my favorite book of the year in 2022.
I know.
Which makes me an honorary dude bro, but go ahead.
I will say it was not my favorite book by a long shot of 2023, which is not to say that I thought it was a bad book. I think it's a very well-written book, very good book. But to your point that people are going to respond to it differently, perhaps at different stages in their life, I think that's very true of Stoner, just in the way I encountered it and responded to it. I mean, I did find the writing style a little too impersonal, a little too detached for my taste. It made it hard to have a strong emotional connection to Stoner, the character Stoner. And I at this point in my life, I like getting that strong emotional connection to characters, which wasn't as important earlier in my life. As a teenager, emotional connection, maybe, but it wasn't that important. But so I found myself able to empathize with Stoner, the character, but it was more challenging to sympathize with him. And, some of the things that he did or didn't do, some of the lack of curiosity, the lack of agency at times, kind of the aimlessness that he shows, and particularly some of the way he interacted with or thought about his family, I found a little off-putting.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some tragic elements with the family dynamics in Stoner. What I love about that book is one, I think I have a soft spot, is what I've learned, for the ordinary man. And I've noticed that even in fantasy, when we follow a character who's not necessarily a superhero type of character, who doesn't power up the whole book. I have a soft spot for that kind of character, the kind of character that other people wouldn't notice and who sticks by their values and might be forgotten in history. So that's why that character spoke to me, because he does hold on to certain ideals. He does hold on to certain virtues, even though he falls short in some areas of his life. And the other thing I love about that book is that even though on the one hand, we could say that there are some tragic elements to his character, like the way that, without giving away too many spoilers, there are some, I think, in his family life. I think that I think that he really shows himself to hold to his values in his academic life, even though there are some challenges along the way. And there's contradiction there. There's a lot of contradiction in that character. And it does seem like, on the one hand, it's easy to read that book and think I've heard people say indifferent. I can get behind indifferent here and there. What I disagree with is, you didn't do this, but what I disagree with is whenever I hear people say he was apathetic. I think that he was not apathetic. And I think
I would agree with you.
And I also think that while there was a layer of indifference, I think some of it was a defense. And what we uncover throughout the book is that he really cares. It's just that he doesn't feel safe to be able to share the extent that he cares. And so I just like that. I like characters that are very complex, that have contradiction to them. And that's how I see Stoner. I just see a lot of different layers and contradictions there. And even though I know John Williams is criticized for his female characters and all the books he writes, which I think is unfair, especially for Augustus, his epistolary masterpiece. But I think Edith is actually a very interesting character that could also be unpacked, and there's a lot more there. So I think it's a book where I think it's easy. I don't know. I can understand. I can understand. It's a boring premise, honestly, of a book, which is given away in the first two paragraphs of the book. But for me, I did get emotional. I did feel for this character. And at the same time, I can understand a lack of sympathy for him for certain choices. So I just appreciate the book for that reason, though. I totally
Here's my
understand.
theory. Here's my theory about what John Williams was trying to do with it. I think he intentionally underwrote the characters. I think as a way to use them as a mirror for readers to hold up and, you know, contemplate their own lives by, you know, projecting themselves into relatively empty lives of the characters in Stoner. You know, and you know, when I say empty lives, I mean they're so underdrawn. There's not a lot of detail there at all, and so you know have this. They're like empty vessels or blank canvases or whatever, where you can project your own feelings and experiences. And uh, and for me, you know, projecting myself onto Stoner, there certainly are some experiences that he had. I was like, well, yeah, I've had some similar experiences to that. But at the same time, in other respects, I got very frustrated because his approach to things was very, very different from my own. If I were inhabiting his character, I would have done some things so very differently. And you know, I think to an extent that's what Williams was trying to do, you know, forcing people to project themselves onto those characters. And whether that's enjoyable or not, it's going to vary from person to person.
I agree. I totally agree with that. Yeah. I love that though. So it worked for me, but I can understand if that's not everyone's cup of
Yeah.
tea. It is certainly weird to me, and it did make me question my reading taste in general, especially 2 years ago because I I allegedly call myself a fantasy book channel. And
Mhm.
here I am with Stoner as my favorite book of the year, which is pretty much the opposite of epic fantasy. And then this last year, I found myself going down a science fiction rabbit hole. And now I am just having an identity crisis with my reading. But that's also part of the fun. So again, novelty and wonder, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, let's see. I am behind on the chat, but I want to go ahead
Oh,
and highlight some comments here. I know Evie did some for me. So here, Eva, I hope I'm saying your name right, said, for me, analyzing a book and finding that it's well done is fun. I think that's something that does become fun
mhm.
the more that you learn those skills. Uh, and I can understand if that's not what makes people gravitate towards books, but it certainly is fun for some of us. Yeah. So I think that was kind of report that was in response to what we were saying earlier about interrogating authors. And then I got a question for you from Polly about your first steps into the genre, please.
Which genre?
That's a good okay, maybe we need clarification on that question before he answers that, because if you watch Bridger's channel, he covers not only science fiction and fantasy, but also spy fiction and
I plan to
right?
cover everything. I just haven't gotten to them yet. You know,
Classics.
mystery, historical fiction. You know, I read very widely and have for a long time. And one of the things that I like to do on my channel is focus on the evolution of genres. Like, you know, where did some of these ideas and tropes and um, you know, narrative approaches originate? You know, things that today are considered cliche. Well, they weren't cliche when they first were thought up, you know, by the very creative authors who thought them up. And so I try to. I'm sorry, I've got a little something's going on with the computer here. Okay, so yeah, I try to provide some context for viewers so that they can see that, you know, there's this conversation that takes place between books over generations. You know, books that were written 150 years ago basically influenced books that were written a few decades later, which influenced books that came a few decades later, and obviously the authors who were writing those books. And so I love, just for myself, I love tracing that progression and understanding what those influences were. And so that's something I find a lot of fun in. And
Yeah.
I make videos about that because I hope there are people out there who also find it interesting to learn about, books that not all of them are good books, but they were influential books in that they got later authors thinking about things that maybe they hadn't thought about before, and then decided, oh, I can do it better than that. And then they do it better. And then someone else comes along and says, oh, well, I can do it better than that. And then they do that. And it's this recursive sort of evolution of genres. And of course, over time, genres start blending together. Things that were defined a certain way at one point in history are now starting to become hybrids. Can you really draw a clear distinction between science fiction and fantasy these days?
Hard,
I
isn't
actually
it?
I spent a couple of weeks not long ago working on a video specifically addressing the long-standing debate about, science fiction and what is science fiction and what is the proper term for referring to science fiction, or terms. And I actually had to set it aside because I was going down too many rabbit holes. It was getting too into the weeds.
Maybe
So
I'll
I
send
do
you a
plan to come
video
back to
because I found it was on an academic website. It was a very concise video on defining what science fiction is. And all these videos, I think, are done by scholars. I'm not totally sure. And so this one person gave 6 things that define the sci-fi genre. I think he starts out by saying it's first of all, a narrative approach, but then he gets more specific. And with each point, I just felt like I had a counterpoint to what he shared. But I wasn't, yeah, I think it's a very difficult thing because you can always think of those counter examples and nothing seems to be either or and seems to fall on a spectrum. And there seems to be some value, I think, in subgenres, for example, too. But then on the other hand, they blend together so much that that can also be over exacting to some point. So, yeah, I would be
and
very curious to hear your video on that, though.
yeah, well, my last video I made, and this is what actually prompted me to think, well, I should kind of extend the discussion beyond it. So my last video was about steampunk, and I guess the basic through line for that video was how steampunk's identity has evolved over many years, and in ways that are actually contradictory. And so what was originally the conception of steampunk is not at all what most people today think of as steampunk. And so I was trying to give examples of where it started and why it started that way, and then how it has been, blended with other genres, other influences, co-opted by some other things. Different values have been attached to it that weren't actually part of it to begin with. And so now there are many, many different definitions of steampunk, whereas originally there was a pretty generally accepted concept of what steampunk was. And I wanted to extend that and say, okay, well, let's talk about science fiction. And if you start defining things, well, science fiction is this. Okay, who's defining it? And
Mm.
whoever is making that definition is, in a sense, asserting control or power over it. And so you have all of these different competing definitions that are pitting, authors against publishers, readers against literary critics, almost everyone against academics and scholars, because they all have their own specific definitions, and they're trying to force their definition on everyone else because theirs is right. for
Mm.
X, Y, and Z reasons. Uh, and it's kind of pointless in some respects, because to try to get into these types of debates of, oh, this is the right way to think about it. I'm pretty agnostic myself. I on my channel use science fiction, I use SF, I use sci-fi. I hyphenate or I don't hyphenate depending on the context. I have thumbnails where I hyphenate sci-fi. I use sci-fi. Well, sci-fi is incorrect. Well, no, it's not incorrect. It's just a question of the audience that I'm using it for and making sure that it is communicating what I want it to communicate to them. And in the context of a video thumbnail where there's not a lot of real estate to work with, spelling out science fiction it takes up a lot of space and is harder to read. And if I contracted it to sci-fi without the hyphen, it's also harder to read. Putting a hyphen in there actually makes that sci-fi nickname more readable. But it's wrong.
I did not know this was such a debate.
It is. It has been.
Honestly.
Oh, this has been going on since before Jules Verne's time. And so that's the video that I was working on was actually tracing. This is a long-standing debate. And there are some who try to just go back to the golden age of science fiction back in the middle part of the 20th century, where science fiction finally became the dominant term, and it was all about, we've got to give science fiction credibility because it is such a disrespected genre. Because it was the least respected genre of all of the genres back in the early up to the mid 20th century. And the easiest way to measure that was it paid the worst. So all of the various pulp magazines that were, paying authors to write adventure fiction, fantasy fiction, mystery, crime, all of these different types of pulpy stories, their value was directly related to how much those magazines were willing to pay for them. Science fiction got paid the least by a significant margin in many cases. So, a lot of the debate over what the proper term is to a large extent about trying to assert a degree of credibility, assert a degree of respectability and elitism that at this point is actually counterproductive. I use the terms interchangeably, as a way of meeting people where they are, so that, they understand what I'm saying, but I'm not trying to impose a specific rule or, custom on them. And
Yes.
I tend to think at least that's the way I hope it will continue. And the trend in recent decades away from really distinguishing science fiction and fantasy and kind of lumping them into a continuum that, under the term speculative fiction, tends to, I think, make more sense. That they're all, fantasy and science fiction are just kind of different ends of that continuum, depending on the degree of plausibility that is involved. And of course, science fiction, as you get farther to the science fiction end of the spectrum, it's things that are going to be more grounded in science, more possible, more plausible. At the other end of the spectrum, the things that are the more fantastical, less likely to be plausible, but still very imaginative at both ends of the spectrum. And but even then, speculative fiction has its detractors because they make the argument, yes, well, speculative fiction is redundant because all fiction is speculative. And well, that's true. That is
Yes.
true. All fiction is speculative, but then again, you could use Tolkien's definitions that he came up with. He wrote a very influential essay, or actually gave a speech, a talk back in the late 30s, but he turned it into an essay in the late 40s called On Fairy Stories.
I read
And
that.
he basically says all fiction is fantasy because fiction is imaginative. You're imagining something. That's fantasy. You're imagining something. But there are different degrees of imaginativeness. I'm not sure that's actually a word, but that the degree of imagination that's involved in creating story does vary across different types of fiction. And he also said that there's an element of joy that is inherent in fantasy stories, which he was defining as fairy stories, but it's really, he's talking about fantasy, that is unique and makes it more enjoyable, more I can't remember some of the terms that he used to describe it, but he considered it a superior form of storytelling because of its ability to induce that sense of joy in readers.
Yes.
And what's really kind of neat is taking that approach that Tolkien had and then match it up with what some other authors who, fantasy authors, the way they've approached things. Stephen R. Donaldson, who wrote the Thomas Covenant series, among other things, has written some pretty thoughtful essays about fantasy and how he
I've read a few
approaches
of those too. Yeah. Yeah.
and
He's
of course,
fantastic. Mm-hmm.
he has a very interesting kind of framework that he looks at it through. That if you look at literature across history, it has a tendency to follow a particular progression from
Mm-hmm.
the idealistic to the nihilistic. He doesn't necessarily use those exact terms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of paraphrasing, putting my own terms onto it, but that's kind of how I interpret his view of fantasy stories or literature in general, but it certainly applies to the fantasy genre. And he also says that yes, you're going from idealism to nihilism, but there are these pit stops along the way, for parody. And then, of course, you've got postmodernism that rears its ugly head in there, which is a close cousin to nihilism, but not quite nihilism. And if you look at fantasy, for example, that's a pretty apt way of looking at it to an extent, because some of the early fantasy stories, just in the modern era, did have a more hopeful type of feel to them. You had characters that were truly heroic. They were characters that were role models that people could aspire to. Those are the characters I identified with as a youngster reading fantasy for the first time. Those are some of the books that absolutely shaped me. I would read these and go, I want to be like that character. I want to be able to make those tough decisions, those sacrifices, those things that are ultimately for the good of others. That's what I want to be. I want to be that kind of a person.
Yeah,
It's
not
great.
only that, but he also was pointing to the fact that a lot of these epic stories, which I think he's arguing influenced fantasy, also
Mhm.
brought forth some of the most important questions for humankind. You know,
That's right.
and that's something that fantasy can offer too, through a secondary
And
world and through these heroic characters, through these
and
challenges and conflicts that they encounter.
that's right. And those questions are in part an attempt to find meaning in life, in sort of our broader existence, or even in more mundane aspects of what we're doing from day to day, individual, or the relationships we have with others. But I think one of the points he makes is that it's a lot stronger earlier in that progression. The more idealistic it is, the stronger those questions and the stronger the answers you get to those questions are. But as you get closer to nihilism, well, that's kind of a tautology. That's the definition of nihilism. Nothing has meaning. Nothing. I mean, there is no meaning to life. There is no answer to these big questions. And I do get that sense reading some modern fantasy that they may have lost sight of what makes fantasy so special. There's not a lot of joy in some grimdark. There's not a lot of, you've got characters in some of these books that there are no good characters. They're all degrees of bad. And, some are just less worse than others. And I don't enjoy those stories as much at all. And I really do worry that, because of the nature of reading teaches us things. Reading shapes our brains. It's conditioning us to respond in certain ways. It's normalizing perhaps certain types of thought processes, certain types of decision making, certain types of behaviors, even if it's doing it unconsciously, but it's conditioning those pathways in our brains that maybe are not altogether healthy. I
It's interesting you bring this up, if you don't mind me interrupting you.
no.
I had a conversation about this with Stephen Erickson, author of Molasses and Book of the Fallen, a few years ago. And I know that we were talking because he specifically does not like the label grimdark applied to Molasses and Book of the Fallen. And I have to agree with that. I've read the 10-book series. I haven't read the Esselmont books. But I think because of where it lands, I personally don't think of it as a grimdark series. And at the same time, when I hear people who've read maybe the first 2 books in the series and call it grimdark, I understand why they say that because it is very dark. There are a lot of very dark and graphic, bleak things that happen in that series, but that's not really the purpose of the series overall. And it's also balanced with a lot of humor and a lot of compassion. And he
Is
is
there
seeking
hope?
to find hope and meaning. Yes.
I mean, that's for
And
me, that's the big thing, is if
mhm,
a story can be grim. I mean, I would hope it's not too grim. I mean, because you can get inured or desensitized to extreme violence, extreme emotional content. And it loses its impact if you start
yes. So
constantly, if you overdo it. And
mhm,
I've only read the first 3 books of Malazan, and that was 20 years ago. So my recollection of them is fuzzy at this point. And I do plan to finish the series. It's just been hard to get around to it, but I do
yeah,
absolutely plan to finish it. But it's and I remember it was grim. It was
it is
grim, but
grim. Yeah.
there are other. And so when I was talking about the nihilistic, I really wasn't referring to
Oh,
Malazan.
no, I
There are
understand
others
that. Yeah.
that I just, there's no hope in here. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's nothing for readers to say, despite all of the, the hardship, despite all of the just really, brutal experiences they had, they persevered. They found a way to really make a very positive thing, or at least create the potential for a very positive thing.
Yes.
I would look to Cormac McCarthy's The Road as a good example of that. That's a really bleak, hard, tough story, but there's hope.
Right. I
Ultimately, there is hope in that story that redeems it, in my eyes. And redeeming it doesn't, I'm not using that in a qualitative sense of good, bad. It's just, for me, my enjoyment of it is redeemed, because up to that point, it's like, there's only so much cannibalism I can take. And
yeah.
I need something a little happier than that. So,
Yes. Well,
um,
no, that was actually the conversation. In the conversation, he was making a very strong stance for hope being an important factor in story as well. And basically making I think some of the same points that you are making. And for me, the statement, I don't know if you've heard the old saying, hope rings eternal. It's something that I think about, or because I'm somebody who tends to enjoy. mm, I tend to enjoy open endings to some extent. I mean, I can understand if an ending is too open and there's not enough conclusion for it to be satisfying. But I tend to have a sense. I like to be left with a sense of wonder about things, And I feel like if there is a little bit of hope in the story at the end, then that can add to that feeling, add to that sense of suspension that things go on rather than things just end. Whereas I think sometimes with the complete hopelessness and meaninglessness of an ending, then that would probably mean maybe, a dead end. But at the same time, I think there's also a place for darker content, and I would also wonder about tragedy. I mean, would you say tragedy? What are your thoughts about tragedy?
I I generally don't seek out tragic books, but at the same time, I have really enjoyed tragic books. I mean, let me use Guy Gabriel Kay as an example. There is tragedy in many of Kay's works. I mean, but it's leavened with hope at the same time. So it creates this bittersweet aspect to almost all of his stories. I love that. Um, Stories that are just purely tragic, it depends on the story, I guess. I mean, I don't want to say I don't like all. I mean, it's going to depend on the story, but it's not something that I really actively seek out. But I can appreciate them, and I can, find that I do enjoy them on occasion. But it's not my preference, and some of it I think goes back to what I was talking about earlier, how reading shapes us. It also in a way sets our moods. I mean, it conditions us to have certain types of moods. I have to look at, I'm stepping back, putting on my sociologist's hat, even though I'm not actually a sociologist, but I'll pretend I am one. That if you look at how the culture of modern society has evolved in recent decades, I would say it has gotten more negative, more pessimistic, more jaded, more sarcastic, more. I mean, the humor has changed from genial humor with a little bit of an edge to humor that tends to be almost all edge and not a whole lot of substance. And I mean, I'm clearly overgeneralizing, but I sort of see that trend, and I look at the extent to which people feel more free to be mean or rude or dismissive or I mean, I get comments on my channel that are absolutely terrible. I mean just
Mm.
personal attacks, and I just have to shake my head and go, what is wrong with people that, wrong in their own lives, in their own sense of being and self-worth or whatever, that makes them feel good to attack someone else who they've never met, who has, I mean, I'm not doing anything to that person. If they don't like my video, fine, don't watch it. It's,
Mhm.
I know my style isn't going to resonate with everybody. Great. Yeah, that's that. I'm not at all uh, upset about that. But to levy some really, really just vicious personal attacks, and I get them periodically, makes me really question, what have they been exposed to in their lives? What media have they consumed that taught them that this is normal behavior, acceptable behavior, or that other people engage in this type of thing in a way that makes it acceptable? And
Well, I wonder about that. I mean, so there are a couple of things here. One
Mhm,
is whether it's the media that's responsible for causing that behavior, or
mhm,
whether there are other circumstances in those people's lives that have
mhm.
caused that behavior. And maybe the media they're consuming is just maybe reflecting back what they've been experiencing. I wonder if there could be more complexity to that. And
I
also
am
another,
sure that there is. I
and
think you're absolutely right. It's a combination of that and many other things. I agree.
yeah, and then yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about is I just from what I remember when I studied aesthetics for fun so many years ago, is I feel like this is very much related to kind of what Plato was arguing with music and with art. Well, he didn't really like art and music that much because he saw it as an imitation, and he already saw all this as an imitation of reality, and art therefore was like a double imitation of reality. But he did argue for, mm, if you were going to consume music, for example, to consume it in certain modes of music that would induce more positive feelings, because he thought that that would create a more positive society. And Aristotle had a counter argument to that. He said that there was a place for tragedy because that allowed catharsis, and that catharsis could be good for society. And so I just find it interesting because I think these arguments have gone on for a long time, kind of variations of it. I'm not saying it's exactly like that with what you're proposing here, but I do think
Yeah.
that, yeah, it's a really challenging topic though, isn't it? Because you were talking when you answered the question, "Why read?" about how what you read defines you. So it is, I mean, it has to influence us on some level, I would
Yeah.
think. But at the same time, I always wonder about what we started with when we started
Right. And
consuming that
it's
material.
those early experiences that are the ones that perhaps are most formative. I've talked before on my channel and on Jimmy's chat several months ago that I mean I started my channel actually with the intent of talking about children's books. That was my impetus
Yes.
because I'd spent several years helping to lead a book club at a middle school, fifth graders and sixth graders at my kid's school, and really enjoyed it, but at the same time was frustrated by what I saw as some of the trends in children's literature. And I wanted to make sure that a lot of the older children's classics, and I'm not necessarily talking 100-year-old classics, although it does include them, but just classics from the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s. I mean, even some from the 80s. It's as if they don't exist anymore. And there's many of those books for many decades. I mean, they stood the test of time. They were, teachers consistently said, these are the books that you really ought to read because they had been proven to be very effective as teaching tools, or very effective at providing good role models for students, or to uh, give examples of different kinds of life experiences for young people to learn from that might be very different from their own. And when you have that consistency over decades and essentially over multiple generations, there's a cultural literacy that gets passed along as those classics are shared from one generation to the next. And you get continuity across generations, so that there is the ability to have a dialogue, not just about the books themselves, but about the meaning of the books, the symbols, the images, the themes, that is really being lost, I think, in the last 25 years. Because many of those books that were taught in schools, or at least were promoted at school libraries or in school book fairs, were those that span generations. And now the impetus, or the real push, is on what's new, because, well, the publishers, they want to push what's new, and and so there you end up with this. I mean, I guess a loss of. I mean, there's a real loss in those books. One of the things that I've seen in recent books is there is a shift toward more frenetic pacing and plotting. The things that are wildly unrealistic, things that involve characters expressing a lot of snark, a lot of cynicism, a lot of world weariness that is completely unrealistic for a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old. And it actually comes across to me as authors working through their own inner demons, but doing it through a children's book.
That's very
And
weird.
and what it does is it seems to be teaching kids who read it the dysfunction that maybe is not exactly healthy for them. Or you have books. I'm going to use the Hunger Games as an example here, and this is not intended as an attack on whether the Hunger Games is an enjoyable book or whatever. I've read the Hunger Games. I did find the trilogy entertaining. I also found it very problematic when considering who was actually reading the books. At my kids' school, there were 3rd graders and 4th graders reading the Hunger Games. Now, I'm sure that Suzanne Collins, who wrote it, was not writing those books for 9-year-olds or 10-year-olds.
I have so many questions for you, Bridger, on this topic.
And those kids, and these were good kids from families that I was scratching my head, going, parents, why are you letting your kids read books about mass murder of children? I mean, and this is, what is it teaching them? What is it telling them at a very impressionistic age about the world, about the values? I mean, is it normalizing violence as a solution to things, conditioning them in a way that makes it more likely that they will view the world from that perspective as they get older? And my theory is that it is. And I'm not blaming the Hunger Games. I'm saying that there's a general trend in recent decades toward more sensational, more violent, much coarser, mean-spirited behaviors of characters. When my oldest daughter was in the book club that I led, and they would read about 15 books a year in the club. I didn't have control over the books that were selected. The books were selected by the librarians, and there was, a desire to obviously try to shape the worldview of the students by picking books that had serious messages in many cases. They wanted to present characters, children who were facing a lot of hardship in their lives, facing social isolation, maybe. I mean, bullying was a very common theme in almost all of the books. So I actually took the books at one point and went through, and I read all of them and said, okay, well, I'm going to do a little statistical analysis here and see, of these 15 books, what are the themes in all of these books? There was bullying in at least 12 of the 15 books, and other forms of emotional abuse and trauma and all of these hardships that all of these characters were facing. And for the most part, not all, but for the most part, the books did have reasonably happy endings where, whatever the trauma was, if it wasn't completely overcome, at least there was a way to deal with it and to learn from it. And, I know when they were picking these books, it was very well intentioned on the parts of the librarians. And there are some wonderful life lessons that the students can learn from those books. But when you look at it, you step back and go, okay, but if in all of these books, there's a very consistent, repetitive theme of social isolation, or treating the world as a very Hobbesian type of world where life is nasty and brutish and solitary. Not quite a quote from Hobbes, but that's the takeaway that you get from those books. That's not me speaking. That was my 12-year-old daughter who shared that perspective with me after reading those 15 books and said, hey, Daddy, why don't we get to read any fun books? Why are all of the books about really unhappy people and really unhappy situations and really problematic behaviors? that might actually be normalizing. That was not her word. I used the word normalizing, but she was basically describing it in a way that said this is what's teaching her own classmates bad behavior, because they see, oh, it really is easy to be a bully, because in this book where the bully finally gets his comeuppance, well, it was such a contrived way to get to the comeuppance that in real life it probably would never happen. So attentive readers with a bullying mindset would go, oh, well, odds are I can actually get away with it, so I'm going to be more aggressive. I'm going to be less nice to people. And that is actually what has been the experience of my daughters throughout their schooling. They're now in high school. I've got my oldest daughter is graduating this year. But there has been far more prevalence, in my opinion, of just really unpleasant social interactions that the kids, and I'm sounding now like a curmudgeon, kids these days, I don't think they've been socialized properly. I don't think they understand how to relate to one another. I don't think they understand what healthy relationships are, what healthy communication is, because they haven't had the kinds of role models that can provide learning experiences for them, because instead they're reading things that are really snarky, really mean-spirited, really violent in many cases, and they're reading them at early ages that are really shaping their brains in unhealthy ways. And then you look at, oh, we've got an epidemic of mental health crisis in high schools. It's like, I'm not saying there isn't a mental health crisis. I'm saying, where do you think some of the root causes of that are, if they've been taught to really fixate on dysfunctional behaviors at a very early age, rather than being given more positive, more wholesome role models to balance out those harsher realities that these books are showing them. And so this is not an attack on realistic fiction for kids, or teaching those tougher life lessons. It's like there needs to be more of a mix, more of a balance, more to provide healthy examples along with the unhealthy ones.
So a couple of things I want to say really quickly is I certainly am no expert on this topic, because I'm really not as aware of the books that are being promoted to children these days. And I know there's a lot of talk about that right now, but I do think it's interesting because my husband and I were watching, it's like a year or two ago now, we were watching a show on Netflix, which we no longer have Netflix, but at the time we were watching on Netflix a show called The Dragon Prince, which is a fantasy cartoon that just came out in recent years. And I found it utterly delightful. I thought it was so much fun, and it was written for children, but at the same time, you could tell that the writers were having fun and that there were certain little jokes that adults could get. And one thing that my husband pointed out, he's a counselor, he pointed out that the characters communicated with emotionally intelligent language. And I wouldn't have caught on to that because I was just immersed in the story and the fun of the adventure. But when he pointed that out, I thought he has a point. The way that the characters were expressing their feelings and communicating to each other, it seemed very natural to me. And at the same time, it was modeling good behavior, good, emotionally intelligent behavior. And it was what enlightened me to the fact that that's actually possible for children to have that kind of model and be presented in a fun fantasy show. And I don't know about literature that does that, but it is just nice to know that that's possible, that that can be available for younger people. So,
my wife and I, we used our own kids as test subjects, in a sense. Raising kids is just a big experiment. We try this little variable, and then we try this variable and see what happens. And we've got a control group here, we try something with one kid but not the other, and we
or doing a research study on your kids.
We were not that
right.
Sort of intentional in how we did it, but we did do some things that I truly believe had a significant positive impact, but also had it created some difficulties for them at the same time. We absolutely limited their exposure to negative media growing up, in their really young formative years. And we exposed them to lots of reading. They were reading very young, and we never spoke to them as if they were kids. We spoke to them as if they were just people. And so in our normal conversations with our kids, when they were 2 years old, 3 years old, we were using vocabulary words that they had never heard before. And that was okay, because at that age, they are sponges. They are just soaking up everything they hear and looking for context clues. And the first time they hear that word, they're not going to know what it means, but they're going to connect it to the other words that they heard. And then the next time they hear the word, they're going to remember, oh, I heard that before, and it was in this context. So let me figure out now, kind of triangulate between those different usages of the word, what it actually means. And so by the time my eldest daughter entered kindergarten, her kindergarten teacher didn't know what to do with her, because she had a vocabulary that was, they tested her. They were, doing standardized testing and all of that. And they said, she's at a 12th grade reading level and she's only in kindergarten. And I don't say that because, oh, she's a genius, she's a prodigy. She's like, she's bright, yes. And I'm very proud of her. But she was exposed to things starting at a very early age, and she simply learned from it. One of the things that we did also, we read to them every night. We would read along with them. They learned to read as we read along. But we also listened to a lot of audiobooks. And I highly recommend for young children listening to audiobooks, especially audiobooks of older works where the language is a little more complex, where the vocabulary is a little more advanced, where they're going to really get a much richer language experience, just English language experience, listening to those books. And so, just from a literacy standpoint, I think it's absolutely essential. Because if you look at where the literacy wars have gone over the last 150 years or so, it used to be back in the mid 1800s, kids were taught to read using phonics. Here's the alphabet, here's what each letter sounds like, and when you combine letters in certain ways, they create certain sounds. And so when you put them all together into words, you sound out the specific.
That's how I was. I think that was how I was taught. I'm pretty sure that was how I was taught to read.
That was the way people were taught for a very long time. But in the, I want to say roughly somewhere around the mid, maybe early to mid 20th century, I think it shifted. I may have my timing wrong here, but it shifted to what's known as whole language, where you read words. You're not reading sounds. You're not reading, the phonemes, the sounds that letters and combinations of letters make. You're looking at the word as its whole thing, almost like an ideogram. Looking at Chinese writing is ideograms. You're looking at that entire word as a picture, and you're assigning meaning to the picture of that word. And so there were studies that were done to say, this is the most effective way to teach. Unfortunately, those studies were not really well designed. No. And so most schools by the mid to late 20th century had shifted to whole language. And They were trying to teach kids to read by just recognizing words and recognize them in the context, say, of a picture. So you'd have a picture book and there'd be a sentence at the bottom of the page. And they would learn to read by little pointers saying, see, spot, run. And there'd be a picture of a dog bounding across the grass. And so the idea was, in the brains of the kids, their brains would associate the word with the image, and that would essentially be sufficient for them to learn how to read effectively. The reality is it didn't really work that well. It worked okay for a certain percentage of kids, but generally under maybe about a third. There's roughly a third of kids who enter school already sufficiently primed to read. Some of them already know how to read. They've had parents who've been reading to them, or they've just had enough verbal experience to be ready. And there might be an element of heredity involved, nature versus nurture to some extent, but nearly everything that I've ever read on the subject, all the studies show that to the extent that there is a nature nurture impact, it's overwhelmingly nurture.
Yes. I actually have
so,
I have something up here on my screen right now about US
sure.
adult literacy facts. And for one thing, it says that 48 million, according to this statistic on proliteracy.com, it says that 48 million adults in the United States cannot read above a third grade level. Now, I've heard some people say that's eighth grade level. On this website, it says third grade level. And it says here at the bottom, though, that according to what they say about family literacy, a mother's reading skill is, I'm sorry, I'm having to strain because it's so tiny here, is the greatest determinant of her children's future academic success, outweighing other factors such as neighborhood and family income.
I 100% agree with that. I think the single best thing you can do as a parent is talk to your kids well. Don't baby talk to them. Don't talk to them as if they are children in very simple language. But of course, obviously, some parents never really developed strong verbal skills, strong vocabulary, and that does put their kids at a disadvantage. That's where audiobooks come in, because the audiobooks can make up for the deficiencies of the parents, where the parents maybe never really learned to be fully literate or to have the ability to communicate at a level above maybe fifth or sixth grade, because fifth or sixth grade level is what newspapers and television, the media all set their comprehension threshold at.
That's what I heard. I actually heard Jenny Wirtz say that as well, that there was actually a point, and she said, I guess it was a few decades ago, I'm not exactly sure when in the 20th century this happened, where a lot of those literacy modes decided to set the standard lower to make it more accessible. Things like Newsweek, the newspaper. Do you remember when that happened, or do you
Well,
recall that
yeah,
historically?
they've reset it a couple of times. I mean, I can say when I was in journalism school, it was a sixth grade level. I think now it's fifth grade, but it was
Hmm.
still low 40 years ago.
Wow.
But also, you had a much higher percentage of the population who never went to college 40 years ago. You
Oh,
had
that's
a
a good
lot of
point.
people who never finished high school 40 years ago. I mean, the percentage is still high today, but it's a lot better today than it was 40 years ago. And so you had this war between the phonics camp and the whole language camp, and both of them could cite studies showing that they were the right approach, and there was validity to some of their findings, because for some readers, whole language does work well, but for a great many readers, it does not.
Hmm.
And likewise, phonics, for many readers, does work well, but not for everybody. That there are differences, and so at that point, some colleges of education who are teaching, training teachers, they kind of threw up their hands and said, well, let's just combine them. Let's do a hybrid. And they called it balanced literacy. And it was maybe worse than either of the other two on its own in some respects, because it was the kind of the equivalent of throwing everything up against the wall and seeing what sticks, which is not inherently bad. It's more in the implementation, because they didn't really provide effective guidance to teachers to tell them this is the right way to combine these two different approaches. This is the right way to sequence them, to introduce certain concepts as a foundational building block that could then be just progressively added to. They didn't fully recognize the impact of environmental factors, such as parental vocabulary and just what they learn or are exposed to at home. Sorry, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold right now.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, so
but
I
so they said this balanced approach, and really that's what ended up getting adopted by all these colleges of education, or a great many of them. Many schools went the balanced approach. Same results. 30% of the students continue to learn just fine reading. Didn't matter whether it was phonics, whole language, whatever, balanced. And then 60% roughly need additional help, but can. And then 10 to 15%, well, I guess another 10% really struggle, but can learn, but are really, really difficult. Those are typically like dyslexic students, where they need a lot more personalized attention, or very, very structured ways of being taught. And then there's about 5% maybe that just, they're going to be illiterate because they're not capable. I mean, they're some of the people who are really learning disabled. I mean, not dyslexia, but I mean, really severely learning disabled. In recent years, just in the last 3, 4, 5 years, there's been new research. And lo and behold, they said, all of these things, the focus on phonics and the focus on whole language, it doesn't really matter which approach you take to some extent. Although they did ultimately say phonics is probably the most important piece. They do ultimately say phonics is better, but it's not an end all be all. But they said it doesn't make any sense to teach people to read a word on a page if they don't actually have that word in their working vocabulary. And so a child's vocabulary actually determines, to a large extent, their ability or their pace of learning how to read. Because when they see a word, and even if they can sound it out using phonics, they're going to sound it out and go, yeah, but I still don't know what that word means because I've never heard that word before. Whereas if a child has heard the word before, has already at least some familiarity with it, even if they're not fully knowledgeable of its meaning, it makes it so much easier to actually learn to read and connect the visual symbols on the page with the oral sound of a word and the connection, the meaning connection that has. And again, goes back to, are you hearing these words at home? Are you hearing them in your interaction with your classmates? Are you hearing them on the television? Are you hearing them in the books that you're reading, whether they're being read aloud to you or you're listening to audiobooks? So I would say for parents of kids who are struggling with reading, get them listening to audiobooks, and get them listening to some older ones that maybe can add a little bit more to their vocabularies and their the complexity of language that they encounter.
That's a great tip. And also, another thing I wanted to ask you about related to all of this is, so you were talking about the curriculum and the types of books that were being promoted in classrooms. But I was curious too, because I went down a rabbit hole watching a literacy expert talk about how the most important thing is that people are reading in general. So I was curious if somebody was let's say, reading a lot of books that have, maybe not the most positive messaging. For example, I have friends who read Stephen King, and I'm sure there are some people in the chat who fall into this camp, who were reading Stephen King when they were 9 years old or 8 years old. And, maybe their literacy level skyrocketed at that point, or they were just voracious readers. Is it better that they're reading rather than not
Yes,
reading at all in that case?
absolutely. I mean, I would say even if they're reading maybe not the best things, or
That's
reading
what I think
manga
too.
is better than not reading at all. And I mean, I don't mean that as a knock on
Right.
manga. I don't really read
Mhm.
manga. I have read some, and read some graphic novels, and it's not my preferred style of reading. And as I said at the outset of this, I think outset meaning when we first started this chat, and you asked me why do I read, and I said, well, reading is a more effective way of learning. It's a more effective way of experiencing other people's thoughts and emotions and life experiences vicariously, because there's more information contained in it. And graphic novels just don't have as much information. That you have to infer an awful lot from the artwork and from the very short speech bubbles that might be in there, that can be still a very entertaining experience, and it is better than not reading at all. But if you're primarily consuming graphic novels as a child, you really are going to be stunted, I think, this is my opinion, when it comes to communicating effectively as an adult,
Hmm.
and or just getting into college and being able to write effectively, speak effectively. I mean, I say that as a former college professor. I was, and I taught at a couple of colleges that are well known and very selective. And the students who go there, outside of the athletes, were A students in high school, and they were, you know, at or near the tops of their class. And yet, when they would be assigned, essays to write, or other kinds of papers, or they'd write short answers in their tests, it was eye-opening to me just how deficient the writing skills were, coming from students who, for the most part, were coming from relatively privileged backgrounds. Privileged meaning they had good educational opportunities as children. They uh, clearly learned enough to be able to make good grades and have good test scores, and yet they couldn't write. They had
Mm.
not. I mean, in a class of, say, 70 students, 80 students, a big survey class that I might have had charge of, if they were writing a 4-page essay, nothing really long, but 4 pages double space is not that hard of an assignment. Maybe 4 students out of 80 were what I would consider truly competent writers.
Mhm.
Like, these people know how to write and they do it well. Maybe another 10 out of 80 were pretty good, but had some significant weaknesses, but were, they had room for improvement, but they were well along the way to learning how to write effectively. And so, I mean, I don't want to knock them, but they were not at that, boy, these people know how to write. This is good writing. But then that left another 50 who were really not good writers. And then another 10 or so that were just outright poor, really just bad writers, and made me go, how did you get into school? How did you graduate from high school being able to write like this? And and this was more than 20 years ago. I mean, I was teaching a couple of decades ago, and this was something that I think has gotten worse, because I see it through my kids, what they see in their own schools and with their classmates. my eldest daughter is, quite frankly, a much better writer at her age than I was at her age. Uh, but she's very, very alone among her classmates. Very few of her classmates really know how to write well at all. They seem to have gotten so used to writing in shorthand. I mean, and I'm not trying to overgeneralize something like, well, there's texting so much, or they're, writing on Discord or on other platforms where everything is abbreviated, where the emphasis is on fast, short, emojis, condensing information into the shortest possible words that you can possibly get at. So that way the conversation moves. But there's a sacrifice, because when you start compressing and condensing information into fewer and fewer words and fewer symbols, a lot gets lost. Meaning gets lost. Ambiguity starts to mushroom. And precision gets lost. And so you have people who essentially have grown up not knowing how to make an argument, not knowing how to structure things logically and communicate it effectively, which is part of literacy. It's not just a function of reading well, it's knowing how to speak well, write well, how to communicate effectively in both directions. And it's a real problem. And again, I think it contributes to what I was talking about before of the difficulty that young people today are having socializing, that they don't know how to communicate with one another effectively. They don't know how to express things with the precision or the depth that they need to. And it's really short-circuiting their growth as teenagers at a very important point in their lives. And again, I'm not a professional. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a professional. So please, anybody in the audience who's listening to me, don't take what I'm saying as gospel that, you should trust everything I'm saying as coming from an expert.
No. Can I share with you a personal story, how I relate to this personally?
Absolutely.
Sure. So when I was on Chatting with Nets last time, Jimmy had asked me because I've mentioned my mother quite a bit on my channel because she's been a huge influence on me. And I love talking with my mother about books. She's far more well-read than I am. And actually, my father, English was his second language. He grew up in Mexico until the age of 18. And then he moved to the United States to pursue a degree in electric engineering, where he met my mom. And oddly, even though English is his second language and he has a very thick accent, he has a far better vocabulary than I do, because he took Latin roots in grade school. And so he knows words. Sometimes I'm stumped on a word and he'll know what it means. And so that always impresses me as well. So I just wanted to mention that piece. But Jimmy asked me if my mother was a big influence on me reading. And I would say she was. When I was very little, she would read to my brother and I. I actually am one of four siblings. I have three older siblings. But my brother, who's just 2 years older than me, we were very close. And so she would read bedtime stories to us until we were old enough to read. And then once we were old enough to read, and he learned to read way earlier than I did, but she'd have us to read to her. And before that, I even remember Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. That was one of the first collections I remember her reading aloud to us. And she even dedicated it to us as her beloveds. But as time went on, I did enjoy books. And what I found was I'm probably, this is kind of funny that we're talking, because I was a kid who was very much into the dark side of things.
You
I
were a
loved,
goth girl.
yeah, I kind of was for a while there. And I was a bit of a hippie too. I had both sides, but I loved horror as a kid. I loved horror. And it was a rebellion thing, I'm sure. My mother tried to keep my brother and I away from it, but I would be up trying to sneak out of bed to watch Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street, which is popular at the time. Content I shouldn't have been watching, but for whatever reason, I was just fascinated by it. And I went to a Catholic elementary school, a private elementary school. It was very rigorous. But when I was around fourth or fifth grade, I enjoyed books, but I don't know that I was completely hooked on reading until I was around maybe 9 years old. And I was in the library when my cousin, who was in my class, she was reading a book by an author, which I don't know if you've heard of, Lois Duncan. She was a popular author in the late 70s and in the 80s. And she lived in New Mexico, which is where I grew up. So there were several Lois Duncan YA suspense horror thriller books there. And I picked up my first Lois Duncan book, and it was called Summer of Fear, and it was a horror book. And I was excited that I was able to check out a horror book in my Catholic elementary library. And that was it. I became hooked on reading, and I read every single book that she had. Then from there, as I got into R.L. Stein's Fear Street
Yeah.
novels. The Goosebumps books came out later. I felt actually a little old for those when those came out, but I enjoyed a few of those. And not to say you can't enjoy them now. I know a lot of people as adults who love those books now, but that was what got me into reading. I was reading a lot back then, but they were mostly horror books. Probably
I
not a
mean,
lot
you
of literary value to those books.
how old were you when you were reading those Lois Duncan books?
Around 9 or 10. Yeah.
And were you reading? I mean, I remember at least one of those Duncan books was made into a slasher film starring Sarah Michelle Gellar
Years
and
later, I read it before it became a movie. That's
right. You know,
I Know What You
I
Did
know what you
Last Summer.
did last summer.
Mhm.
Exactly. And I actually found that in my daughter's Catholic middle school library too, and looked at it and went, I'm not sure they realize what they have here. Unless the movie,
Exactly.
I did not read the Lois Duncan books. It would those came out sort of after I had already graduated beyond. You
I'm a
know,
little younger than
I
you.
was
Yeah.
yeah. So, but I am aware of them, and I had seen the movie years ago, and so when I saw that and went, wait a second, this is a kid's book, a slasher movie was based on a kid's book. Uh, anyway, so that's where you got your dark side.
But it got me into reading, which is the nice thing. And I kind of fell in and out of it as I got a little older into high school. I found fantasy later and started to love that. I found my first sci-fi book, which is a time travel book called Summer of Love, which is a very fascinating book in my opinion. But I love what you're sharing because I'm not surprised by anything you were sharing about your experience with student writing because I when I started college, well, maybe I'll backtrack. When I took English literature in high school, I so I was no longer in private school when I entered high school. And I did notice a big difference, by the way, in the education I received from a Catholic private school to an even public middle school. I made straight A's without even trying when I entered public middle school. But when I went to high school, I didn't, for whatever reason, enter the AP or honors English classes, which was to my detriment because aside from maybe senior level English and maybe an English class I took one summer as a freshman, most of my English classes were ridiculous. I remember writing essays, and my teacher would give me 500 out of 400 points on my essay, and I never received any critical feedback. So when I got to college, I remember entering my first English class, and my mother, like I said, she had a degree in English literature. She told me, she said, if you ever want me to edit any of your papers or give you feedback, I'd be happy to do that. So I remember writing my first essay for freshman English for college, and I asked for my mother for feedback, and she read the essay, and it was funny because she went sentence by sentence with me, and she said, "Okay, read that out loud. What are you trying to say? That is an awkward sentence the way you wrote it. Can you tell it was awkward? Okay, that's what you're trying to say. Let's rewrite that." And she sat down and she actually taught me how to write. And I'm so grateful to this day that she spent all that time with me, helping me out, improving my vocabulary or word choice in certain sentences. And it was wonderful. I I like I think my appreciation and my admiration for my mother skyrocketed because I knew she was a smart woman. I didn't realize how smart she was. I realized, wow, my mother is very smart. And she helped me learn how to write. She helped me build skills that my high school English teachers did not teach me. And I could tell because of my mother's help I was far and above most of the other students in my classes for in college English, which is sad because I mean, I still had a lot to learn, as the years went on, and I have learned more, but I still feel like I fall short. I still feel like there's much more I could learn about writing. But I feel sad looking back at that and realizing just how limited my education was
Yeah.
and just thinking
I,
about it's just sad. For example, had a retired football coach as a teacher for one of my English classes in high school. And I don't think we read Grapes of Wrath. I'm pretty sure we just watched an adaptation of it. It was pretty sad. It was pretty pathetic. So I just wanted to share that personal
I,
story with you.
I think that's great. I had a similar experience, only a little bit different. Through high school, I had, I actually think I had good English teachers, English language arts uh, teachers in high school in everything except writing. In other words, they did a great job of, introducing different types of literature, doing literary analysis, of uh, broadening vocabulary. I mean, my vocabulary was already pretty good, but in general, they were very good teachers in everything except teaching how to write. And there really weren't that many opportunities to practice writing. And writing requires practice. To get really proficient at it, you have to practice it regularly and get feedback. That's the key part. And you were pointing that out with your mother. Absolutely essential to get feedback to point out this is what worked and this is what didn't work. And I didn't usually get a lot of useful feedback on papers that I would write. And so when I graduated from high school, my writing was competent, but competent in a more mediocre competency, not a really, really good competency. And so I had a bit of an awakening when I went to college and started realizing that maybe still have a good bit to learn to be a better writer, be a better communicator. And so when I had that epiphany and changed majors from engineering to journalism, as I said, my motivation was I want to learn to be a better communicator. I want to learn to write better. I didn't choose a major in English, English literature or anything like that, which is not to say that you can't learn to write well in that type of a program, because I think you can, but it's going to be a little different kind of writing. And it may not be quite as rigorous in terms of the types of feedback that you get, because you're not going to be writing all that much. You're going to have maybe a couple of papers a semester to write, and oftentimes you're going to have a term paper that you're going to turn in, and you might not ever get it back graded and corrected, with the comments from the professor. So you have no idea how well you did other than your final grade on the course. In contrast, journalism is boot camp for writing.
Mhm.
A journalism program, you write every day and you get instantaneous feedback. I mean, in our, everybody in journalism school, you take a couple of basic journalistic writing classes. And the professor, when I was in, he was a retired newspaper reporter and later editor who had many, many years experience and had no qualms about pulling out his red wax pencil and marking up your paper right in front of you, because we'd sit in class and we'd have an assignment, which is write a 2-page article about, here's your facts. Turn all of these facts into a news article. Summarize it, organize it, present it in a way that's clear, coherent, concise, that's going to fit within kind of the journalistic style principles, where you want to use economy of words. More words is bad because you have a limited amount of space in a newspaper to be able to fill. So you have to write very, 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 very crisply. And so we'd spend, 20 minutes madly typing on our typewriters, actual typewriters with paper. And, it was timed. We had to generate it very, very quickly, which meant we didn't have the luxury of, well, let me think about how I want to say this. And it was forcing you to communicate on the spot, clearly organized, with language that was going to be broadly understood by the audience that you were writing for. So after 20 minutes, you pull the paper out, you bring it up to him, and he just goes boom, 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 and you get it back and you go, oh, well, wow, that really wasn't very good, was it? Yeah, I was so proud of that. And okay, I'll do better next time. Repetition over and over and over again. And then in other courses where it maybe wasn't quite as much of a boot camp, there was still a very high premium on writing clearly and on deadline. I mean, you had to write things quickly. You had to turn something around overnight, for example, and produce it for a quick grade and again, marked up, redlined. So my pride of authorship got humbled very quickly in that program. And I realized I have a lot to learn here. I can be a much better writer, because in high school, the premium was on showing off all the vocabulary that you had learned. I mean, here are these teachers that are saying, for the SAT, you need to know all of these vocabulary words. So heck, what's the point of learning all these vocabulary words if you're not going to use them? So of course I use them. Just I didn't really use them very effectively. I overused them, or rather than using one $10 word in a sentence, I'd use 3 or 4, which actually kind of clogs up the sentence, and it's not a good thing when you string so many together in one sentence. So I had to unlearn all of those bad habits. I had to unlearn nesting clauses within clauses, and grammatically correct, stylistically highly problematic.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
So I was a competent writer in that my grammar was good. My teachers taught grammar well, but they didn't necessarily teach good, clear, well-organized writing. And that's something that journalism school just pounded into my skull and to everybody else who was in it. But that wasn't, that was a very, very important point for me, learning how to write. But it wasn't until I actually went to work for the World Bank, and I ended up working alongside the single greatest writer I've ever encountered, actually personally known and had a chance to experience their writing. He was a British gentleman who had previously been the chief speechwriter and policy advisor to British Prime Minister Edmund Heath in the early 1970s. This was a guy who was so incredibly eloquent in how he wrote, but at the same time, he wrote so concisely, so clearly. Everything was structured very, very well. And so he was writing technical documents. I mean, these were communiques to foreign governments explaining very technical subjects, or, trying to convince them why they needed to pursue a particular approach. And, that's not the same thing as journalism school writing, where that was mostly, can you basically organize facts in a very clear, concise way? It wasn't advocacy writing. It wasn't explanatory, like educational type writing, where you're trying to explain things in a very different kind of context. But the way he wrote was so incredibly effective, and I just tried to be a sponge with him and learn from his writing style. And I know that I'm not nearly as good as he ever was. But it was a very formative experience getting that exposure, building on top of the journalism school background that I had.
Ah, that's fantastic. What a wonderful experience to learn how to write from someone like that. Yes. I keep a journal. I've always kept a journal, and I feel like that's helped me in some ways. Even though,
Mhm.
but the problem with that is again, like you said, you don't get the feedback. You don't get the immediate feedback because that's for you. It's personal.
Yeah, I mean, the hardest part for me in making videos is figuring out what I want to say. Uh, and so you, I do suffer from writer's block sometimes. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and so there are times when I'm writing something up and then I just say, this just isn't good enough. This isn't organized most effectively. It's I'm burying the lead too much. I need to rethink how I approach this. And I probably do that too much these days with my channel, and it does slow down my production. But at the same time, I'm not getting paid to do this. This is something that I'm doing for fun, and I do really want to put out the best product I can. But I am trying to stop doing it maybe quite as much, and be a little more like, okay, that's good enough. Let's just get something out there that maybe isn't quite what I want, but is going to do the job.
We all have to do that with our art at some point, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it doesn't matter
exactly.
what it is. Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you too, going back to children's literature,
Uh-huh.
your thoughts on YA marketing, on young adult marketing, because we have a huge growing YA section, specifically for, especially for fantasy, which did not exist when I was young. There was not really there was a YA section, but it was, I remember things such as, well, the books I talked about, there was a little bit of a YA horror section, but there was also, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys,
Mhm.
Babysitter's Club. But I didn't see fantasy as a thing probably until the Twilight phenomenon. I think that that was what really got fantasy YA on the map, and Hunger Games added to that as well. Of course, Harry Potter, but Harry Potter, I would still place that a little more towards middle grade. But what are your
Well,
thoughts about those kinds of marketing? Because like going
you,
into a
you,
bookstore, for example.
that's a subject I have a lot of thoughts on, and not all of them fully resolved.
I
I mean,
don't either.
the definition of YA has clearly changed over the years. What was YA? I mean, I think at the dawn of YA might have been around the mid 90s when that term sort of came into use, but it was a substitute for teenager.
Mhm.
It wasn't young adult. I mean, adult is okay, depending on how you define it, either at 18 or 21, but let's say it's 18. You're going off to college, you're an adult. That's not actually who those books were being written for in the early days of YA. YA was a way of up branding books written for a little bit younger kids.
I
In the same way,
distinctly I'm sorry, I just wanna say I
oh no,
distinctly remember when I was a kid and grappling with that because I would be reading YA, young adult, but all the characters were teenagers
yeah.
and thinking, they're a little young to be adults, but it's called YA?" So, I remember grappling with that when I was younger.
It's why there are almost no G-rated movies in the US anymore.
Mm.
Now, there are still movies being made that are effectively G-rated movies, but they're not marketed as G-rated movies because G has, I mean, over time, it got a connotation for being for little kids. G is what you take a 6-year-old to. You don't bring a 10-year-old to a rated G movie because, well, that's only for little kids. And for a long time, Disney, for example, had a strict policy that the Walt Disney Studio, as opposed to Touchstone or some of the others that it had as uh, you know subsidiaries of Walt Disney Corporation, But the Walt Disney Pictures was, by rule within the company policy, only G movies, until they suddenly discovered that they were losing part of their market because the market was feeling, I'm not a little kid anymore. I'm 9. I don't go see G-rated movies. So all of a sudden, Disney switched, and now almost every one of their movies is a PG movie. The substance of the movies, in some cases, hasn't changed. It's the marketing of the movies has changed. And same thing happened with YA. YA started out, I mean, the term YA wasn't used, but the Hardy Boys, when they first appeared in the 1920s, were targeted at ages 12 to 16. Nancy Drew, same thing. I mean, all of those early chapter books featuring teenage protagonists, they were written for teenagers. And over time, a lot of those chapter books, at least the ones that survived over the decades, like the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, they got progressively abridged and rewritten to make them easier to understand for younger readers, because older readers stopped reading them. Teenagers stopped reading the Hardy Boys sometime around the 1960s. And by the 1980s, it was hard to find a 12-year-old reading the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew. And so each time that happened, the publisher said, okay, we need to rebrand it. But as part of the rebranding, we're going to rewrite them a little bit to simplify the language, simplify the sentence structure, take out a little harder vocabulary words, put in easier words. And now the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, even the editions that you buy today, they are targeting like 8 to 10-year-olds, as opposed to the original 12 to 16-year-olds that they were written for back in the first few decades of their existence. YA, same thing. When the YA label came into being, perhaps in the mid-90s, it was just a way of relabeling teen fiction, until teen fiction became, well, we've got teens who are, some actually more mature than others, others wanting to be more mature than they actually were. And you had authors who were also discovering in the in the wake of the success of certain teen marketed books, whether it's the later Harry Potter books, not the earlier ones. I think the early ones are very focused on younger kids. The later Harry Potter books very clearly are aimed at an older age group.
Yes.
But seeing the success of books that were targeting a little bit older ages, the Twilight books, another example, massive success. Authors said, oh, we can write for teenagers and young adults at the same time, but actually we're writing for young adults, true young adults, truly, people who are better equipped to handle the violence, the sex, the emotional abuse that occurs in a lot of those stories. There's complexity in those stories that I would say a lot of early teens and even middle teens aren't well equipped to read and understand. Not all. There are exceptions, absolutely. But I'm just generalizing. Maybe those books are not best suited for them. I mean, it's sort of like I said about the Hunger Games. When I read the Hunger Games, which was probably about a couple of years after they came out, after they became a big deal, and I was like, what's the big deal about this book? And I was actually reading a lot of books, kid books that were being written at that time, because I was pre-reading things for my own kids. I wanted to get ahead of my kids to know, what are the books that they're going to be exposed to? What are the books that they're going to encounter and have to make a decision? Do we read it or do we not? And I wanted to, in some respects, be able to make suggestions to them and say, hey, here's some good books that you're really going to like, that are going to be great experiences for you, and kind of steer them away from the books that maybe weren't best suited for them at that age. The Hunger Games was a perfect example. I read it and said, okay, this is a book that's it does have some troubling themes in it, but I could see high school students reading it and having, little difficulty with those themes if they were sufficiently mature. I mean, not a problem at all. Elementary and middle school students, not so much. And yet the publishers knew who was reading those books. They were being marketed to younger students, at least implicitly. Suzanne Collins, before she wrote The Hunger Games, she was a children's book author. I mean, she wrote the Gregor series, which is kind of a retelling of the Alice in Wonderland story, set in beneath the sewers of a city. I mean, it's the Underland Chronicles. I mean, that was her big series hit before she wrote The Hunger Games. So she had already primed a very younger audience to want to read her books. And then she wrote a book for a much older audience. And yet the younger kids got a hold of it and were like, ooh, look what I'm reading. I'm reading something that's really not appropriate for me, but I love this. This is great.
That probably would have been me if I discovered it as a kid.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. You were reading, about mass murderers and as a 9-year-old. And I mean, I was reading, Stephen King at 11 and 12. And
there you go.
Clearly King wasn't writing those books for me, but I don't think it necessarily warped me. But I didn't, at the same time, I wasn't binging on King. I was actually reading a lot of other stuff that was, I would say, much more wholesome. And I mean, I'm hoping I'm not coming across as well, let's see, get my language straight here. I hope I'm coming across as someone who is not a prude. I'm not trying to be a prude or a scold or but I'm sort of looking at it more analytically, going, what really is the impact here of exposing kids to subject matters that they maybe are not well equipped to handle? And YA is a good example of that. I mean, I've read Shadow and Bone. I've read the first book, from Sarah J. Maas. I mean, I sampled a lot of those authors because I knew potentially they could be influences of my own kids. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know what they were experiencing. And I have to say, I read some of those books and went, well, some are just not very well written, in my opinion. Which is not to say they're not entertaining. It's just very derivative, very unoriginal, and writing very clunky in many cases. But again, can still be very entertaining. Do I want my 12-year-old reading Sarah J. Maas? No. The Leo Bardugo, Shadow and Bone has some really problematic relationships in there that are not good role models for boys or girls in terms of, kind of the abusiveness of it, and not both emotional abuse as well as sexual abuse that is troubling because it could be perceived as normal by.
I find that fascinating because
readers.
That does seem to be prevalent in a lot of romance for whatever reason. And I've noticed that I have read quite a bit for a while there. I was reading quite a bit of YA and I did see that come up. That's a recurrent thing. It's also a recurrent thing in some of the pop music I've listened to. And I wasn't conscious of that until, like I said, my husband and I were analyzing pop music lyrics, and a lot of them were based on just really poor boundaries. And if you listen to the text, if you listen to what the relationship dynamics were in some of the songs.
Were you listening to Lil Kim by any chance? Or,
I don't remember. I'm so bad with knowing the
some of those get really, 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 really graphic, leave absolutely nothing to the imagination in the song lyrics. So there was something I was going to say.
And I'm not saying that shouldn't exist. I just mean it's just sad not to have different models or different examples. And it does. I can see your point though, that if people are reading that, if kids if younger people are reading that, then they might not have other examples that they can look to as well.
And and
It becomes
and
normalized.
when they go to TikTok and they see all of these people touting how wonderful something is, and I'm gonna use the Thomas Covenant Chronicles as a case study here. And I don't know if you've ever read it. Thomas Covenant, I mean, this was a very influential trilogy, or the original trilogy was written back in the 1970s. Very original, very influential. The protagonist, Thomas Covenant, is very unlikable. He does really terrible things, but it's done in a context where you understand why he's doing these really terrible things. They're not gratuitous. They're part of a larger story arc and character arc. It's really kind of a redemption story of sorts, where he's facing aspects of himself and his own self-loathing, and how he acts on that self-loathing is very problematic. I mean, he early in the first book, and this is a spoiler, but it's something that's been spoiled many times, and many people, it's the first thing out of their mouths when they say how much they hate the Thomas Covenant Chronicles. Thomas Covenant, a roughly 30-year-old man, shortly after being transported to it's a portal fantasy, he's transported to this magical land. He meets and rapes a 16-year-old girl. That's bad. I mean, it's bad. However, there is context for it. There is a reason for it. There is, and it's an act that absolutely shapes who he is and who he becomes over the course of 10 books in that series. He feels remorse. He feels absolute self-loathing for the fact that he did that terrible thing. But he does do a very terrible thing. Okay, so people, some people have read the books and go, I hate the Thomas Covenant Chronicles. I will never read it because of that event. Mm-hmm. Ignoring the context. Okay, that's really interesting to me, because those same kinds of people will then turn around and read Leigh Bardugo or Sarah J. Maas, where there is actual rape and no consequences, by and large, for the rape. There's not a whole lot of remorse expressed by the perpetrator. They might get their comeuppance at some point, but it's presented almost gratuitously, almost as if it's normal. It's presented in a way that actually, I think, does far more harm than what actually, this one very quick, isolated event at the start of, an almost 50-year-old fantasy trilogy. And yet there's a clear double standard here. Likewise, some of the same people will point to Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Rape is kind of central to that story. And yet it's lauded as a wonderful story telling about how horrible Gilead is. And I think highly of The Handmaid's Tale. I'm not criticizing Atwood's story at all. I'm pointing out that there's a difference in how people perceive things, where it's okay for Margaret Atwood to basically talk about rape in the context of a story where it's central to the characters, it's central to the narrative, the themes, and yet it's highly improper for Thomas Covenant, written by Stephen R. Donaldson, to do the same thing, and on a much more limited scale. I wonder, what is it about, and we're getting back to YA, YA literature seems to really play into the sexual and emotional abuse themes far more than even adult fantasy or just adult literature does, to a large extent. And so That to me is a conscious decision on the part of authors and publishers who are saying, we know who our market is, and young students are a key part of, or young people are a key part of that market. And so we're going to give them what they want, because heck, what teenager isn't sexually curious? What teenager isn't, thinking, that, are imagining situations that they might be in, hopefully more positive situations, but where they haven't had the actual life experience to know what's real and what's not, what's acceptable and what's not. And yet it feels so transgressive. It feels so exciting. And I get it. I mean, I read things as a, preteen and as a teenager that gave me the same feelings. Is that a good thing from a societal standpoint, aggregating across all of the kids who are getting exposed to this? Is this in fact contributing to the mental health crisis that teenagers are facing because the role models they're reading about are really not good role models, and they're learning, they're taking away the wrong lessons from that? And I don't know if that's true or not. Those are just the thoughts that run through my head as I encounter that in
Yeah.
books.
It's such a tricky topic. It's such a tricky topic because, some teenagers read they read adult literature,
Mhm.
and they might not have maybe the skills yet to understand context. Like, for example, with the Thomas Covenant series you're talking about. Now,
Right.
as someone who does mostly read adult literature these days, I sometimes feel, I was actually thinking about this the other day, how I will read books and sometimes there will be some scenes like that. And I don't really, it's very strange because I'll give you an example. I just recently read The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I loved the book. I on so many levels, I love that book. But there was a scene that could be considered problematic, and you probably know the scene if you've read it. And I honestly, when I finished the book, I was so thrilled with the book. I couldn't say enough good things about it. But then a friend of mine pointed out, "Well, what did you think about that scene, though?" And then I realized, oh wow, I just that yeah, I don't really have an answer for that particular scene. I know there are answers out there, but I don't know that I necessarily can speak to that. And and yet, when I read adult literature, I don't really usually when those scenes happen, it's not usually the thing that will make me love the book. For example, if that scene wasn't in the book, I would have loved the book just as much. It's not what I think about when I think I love that book. And yet I also take it on good faith that as people who are adults reading this book, that they'll understand that if I don't mention that one scene and I say I love the book, that on good faith, I imagine they will understand that I love the book based on other things or the things I specifically state, and that it doesn't mean I'm okaying that. But it's a challenge because that kind of content does come up a lot in adult literature, and it does require some unpacking. And I do think it's good and healthy sometimes to unpack those things and understand context. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm in agreement with you. I uh, just I wonder who really. Uh, I mean, some of it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that the people don't know how to have fun anymore. That may sound like a non sequitur, but hear me out. That what generates an effective level of dopamine or other neurotransmitters that give us pleasure, that give us enjoyment, the things that are training us to come back for more. It's getting harder and harder to reach that threshold with the stimuli that we're getting, stimuli from media, whether it's movies and television, whether it's books that we're reading. It takes more spectacle, more intensity, intense graphic violence, intense emotional trauma, intense, whatever it is. Maybe it's just wild action scenes, things that are totally ridiculous and implausible, never going to happen. But hey, it's new, it's exciting, it's something that nobody has ever thought of before. So let's pack it in here.
Mm.
And over time, we get desensitized. It takes more to get us over that hurdle to say, oh, that was really good. That generated, that stimulated the pleasure centers in my brain. And you see that in YA literature. They keep ratcheting up the stakes, ratcheting up the graphic content, they ratcheting up things to almost in a game of one-upmanship. Well, this has been done before, and so I can't do the same thing that's been done before. I have to push it a little bit farther and a little bit farther. That's true in YA. It's true in fantasy. It's true in science fiction. I mean, it's true in crime fiction. The crimes keep getting more and more horrific, and the descriptions of them more and more graphic. And going inch by inch, a serial killer. Whereas, well, take Silence of the Lambs, which was written 30 years ago or more. You've got a serial killer who strips his victims of their skin. That's a pretty horrific thing, but it doesn't really go into graphic detail of exactly every inch of how he flays his victims. Today, if that book were written today, I'm sure that authors would make sure to include exactly the gory details of that flaying. I mean, I'm sorry for those of you in the audience who are cringing at the thought of that, but I'm assuming that people are familiar with Buffalo Bill from the Silence of the Lambs.
Yes.
But it's the shock value has gotten worse. Horror
That was
films
pretty
got more
shocking when it
shocking.
came out too.
When it came out, it was shocking. But now you've got the whole Saw franchise of movies, which are appalling. But then, hey, that got one-upped by the Centipede movies. And if you don't know about it, don't look it up.
Yeah.
Don't look it up. Those are movies that I just go, how does this in any way improve the human condition as art? And I like to think of art, again, very broadly, as these are things that add value to life, that, and even negative art, art that makes us feel uncomfortable, art that makes us afraid, can still be valuable. So I'm not saying all art has to be positive. I'm just saying art, though, keeps getting pushed into farther and farther extremes, that it makes it harder for me to recognize what its artistic value actually is as a contributor to making, human existence more meaningful, more worthwhile. I don't know. Oh, DK Moon, I'm sorry you actually watched Centipede. I have not watched it, and I don't want to watch it, but I know enough about it to know that's not my cup of tea.
I guess I feel conflicted about this topic because on the one hand, I'm really happy that it's, even if there are areas where there could be improvement, I'm grateful to see an expanding YA market at the same time. I'm grateful to see that more people are reading. And I personally, I don't have a TikTok account. I don't watch TikTok. I don't have anything against book TikTok if it's getting people to pick up a book. Now, whether that book might not be the best of literature, at least it gets them started. It gets them in the doorway. I guess that's how I see it. But at the same time, I do see room for improvement for other types of books. And I think there are probably a lot of great young adult books out there that we're not talking about, that are probably not getting enough attention.
Yep.
Or maybe some that we're just kind of not leaving out of the conversation for now, just to talk in generalities. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to add that layer to it. The one part that makes me, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying, I don't want to overgeneralize. I mean, I'm making these broad statements, but at the same time, there absolutely are exceptions, and probably in many cases, maybe they are the lion's share of, examples of YA books that, some of the ones that I'm cherry picking are more extreme examples. So I'm not trying to paint them all with the same brush at all.
Yeah.
But
It is a
it
little
does.
weird. There's some ambiguity though. I could say for myself, I read the first A Court of Thorns and Roses book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, and I also read Mass's book Crescent City, which is her official adult fantasy book. And I considered Crescent City my least favorite book the year I read it. I really did not like it at all. And I did not like A Court of Thorns and Roses. I just personally found it boring. But at the same time, I have my sister in law, for example, she's 30 years old. She just started getting into A Court of Thorns and Roses and has been loving it. And my sister was telling me that people at her pharmacy are really into that series. And I'm really excited that people are getting into fantasy, even if it's a type of fantasy that does not appeal to me on any level. I'm really
Here's a
excited for
question for you.
yes.
Here's a question for you. I bet exactly what you're talking about, or very close. So it sounds like, this may just be a matter of taste. Your taste is different from their taste.
Mhm.
But here's the question: is taste a reflection of who a reader is, or an intention of who the reader wants to be?
I don't really okay, here's my answer to that. I don't think that people are thinking about taste when they're picking up these books. And I think especially if they're picking them up to just get into reading for entertainment. And they haven't read, for example, in the case of my sister-in-law, I know she read here and there a few books, in years prior, but she wasn't really reading voraciously, and so maybe this was her way to get back into the habit of reading, and I think that there's nothing wrong with that. I know that for me personally, I could tell you that I've gone through various phases where I just went through several years where I was not reading for fun. I was not reading fiction, whether that was because I was in college or because I had certain life events going on or certain things, certain circumstances that were just for whatever reason I wasn't picking up a book. And I know when I started getting into the habit of reading regularly again and specifically fantasy, later in life, I did go through a phase where I was picking up YA fantasy. And part of that was due to finding out about BookTube and seeing people on BookTube at the time. The algorithm, it did point me to Daniel Green, but it started pointing me to a lot of YA focused channels focused on YA fantasy. And yes, they were all adults talking about YA fantasy. And so that was actually what got me into reading a lot of YA fantasy at the time. I was not analyzing what my taste was specifically. I was just trying books out. I knew I wanted to read fantasy and I wanted to have fun. And I didn't buy any of the books at the time because I knew I wasn't sure what my taste was. So I was checking these books out from the library and I had a good time. And I think the reason why, as an adult, I was appreciating YA fantasy is because, for one thing, when I grew up, when I was younger, like I said, there wasn't a YA fantasy section. And when I did read fantasy, I read books like Lord of the Rings, Elric, and Eddings, and Piers Anthony. A lot of books that didn't have very good female representation. I didn't feel like I
What?
saw my.
Piers Anthony? The novels of Xanth have bad female representation? What are you talking about? I'm
I
being
only read a
sarcastic
few.
here. I'm being very sarcastic. That's some of the worst female representation. But
Well, and at the time, it was interesting because at that time, when I was a teenager, I was around, I spent time with a lot of friends who were much more well read than I was. A lot of guys who read Dune when they were kids and were reading, like I said, reading Stephen King when they were 9 or 10 years old. And when I was reading David Eddings and having the hardest time getting through the Millennium trilogy, just bored out of my mind every time I kept trying to get into it, I would be asked, "Why? Like, what's wrong with you that you don't like this book?" So I did take issue. I did take that in and think, "Oh, wow, I something's wrong with me that I'm not loving these books. What's wrong with me?" Because I think I love fantasy, but I'm having a problem that I'm not connecting to these books like they are. It's something's wrong with me. And so later on in life, when I got into fantasy, I think that the YA fantasy books, I agree with you. And I don't think this is necessarily the best thing. It does feel like they're written for an older audience. And I felt for me, that was a good thing at my point in life because I actually found myself, I felt like I was seen as a female reader in a fantasy book. I found my representation of myself. Not only that, I found that a lot of YA fantasy had greater diversity, greater representation, it tackled a lot of mental health themes much more effectively than some of the adult fantasy I found later. So I thought it was really good for me for a time for the time being. And I really don't mean to be a gatekeeper in saying this. I really don't. I ended up decide it got me in the door though. It got me to read
Mhm.
more books. And the more I read, the more I found that the complexity in YA fantasy just wasn't quite enough to satisfy me. And that's when I started reading it's not that I didn't read adult fantasy before that, because I did, but I started reading a lot more adult fantasy because I enjoyed the complexity of world building specifically and some of the more adult themes. And so, yeah, that was basically what happened for me. So for me, it served a purpose. It did serve a purpose in building a bridge into reading more complex books, into building more critical thinking skills. And I don't mean this to sound pejorative because I do think I can understand enjoying YA fantasy as an adult, and I just wanna encourage people to read. I think that's the most important thing to me personally, but for me personally, I did find that with a lot of the YA series I was reading, every single time I would read a YA series, the second book always felt like it dropped in quality for me. Like, suddenly we'd be focused more on a romance than a quest or something bigger in the world, and the world building felt a little more shallow for me for whatever reason. There were certain exceptions. So that was why I dropped off on reading YA fantasy. But I can't fault it for serving that purpose. I do find an issue with the fact, though, that it is marketed towards adults because I do want there to be more books for younger readers. And I also have a concern about the fact that it's so gendered. That if you go into a YA section, it's predominantly female and which was good for me, like I said, as somebody who was
Mhm.
looking for my voice in fantasy. But I feel sad about that. I think that's very limiting for the male teenagers out there who wanna get into the genre. Uh,
Well,
yeah,
for a couple of
especially
things. One,
yeah.
I agree with you that it's better to read bad fiction than no fiction. Um, I mean, it's just gonna be better. I mean, there may be some exceptions to that if the fiction is just so utterly or irredeemable, but I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head. So let's just say reading is good. Some reading is better than others, though. Certain types of reading, certain types of books are going to have more value ultimately than others. But if it comes down to a choice between not reading at all or reading very sparingly and reading a lot more of things that maybe aren't the best or provide the best role models or the best uh, levels of quality writing and vocabulary and things, that's still better than little at all, or none at all. And if it stimulates a joy, it stimulates a desire to continue reading. That's all for the good, and that's what um, elementary school teachers are really struggling with right now. To bring it back to early childhood exposure, they are struggling. There's a huge gender divide, and the I remember reading recently that the U.S. government, the Census Bureau, or maybe the Bureau of Labor Statistics, one of the agencies, they do a regular annual or biannual um, survey of reading habits, and they track by age group, by other demographic groups, whether they read for pleasure, how much they read for pleasure, and the incidence of reading for pleasure reading has dropped since, I think, the article was looking back as far as 2004. But even at 2004, it had dropped from a couple of decades before that. But the article I was reading was just looking at it from 2004. And if I remember correctly, the stats were something like in 2004, about 26%, I think it was something around that, 26% of adults over at the age of 18 in the US read something for their own personal interest. It didn't have to be fiction, but just something of their own choice for their own personal interest in any given day. So that includes just reading the newspaper. That includes reading. I probably does not include reading a menu at a restaurant, but but choosing to consume written media of some kind, not because you're required to, not because it's for school, not because it's for work, but just of their own volition. So that means probably somewhere less than a quarter, maybe 20%, I'm guesstimating here, actually read fiction on any given day. That's aggregating all male, female, everybody over the age of 18. Huge gender divide. Females were up around, I think, 28%. Males were down closer to 20%, or maybe even a little below. I think it was maybe a little above 20%, something like that. So there's about an 8 percentage point gap between male and female daily readership. And this is just seeing, did they read 10 minutes? I mean, this is, did they read anything for pleasure, not a certain amount of time? Now in 2022, which is what this report went up to, both genders have dropped about 10%. I mean, 10 percentage points. So where female readers were up close to 30%, now they're down close to around 20%. Wow. And where male readers were up around, 21, 22%, something like that, now they're down around 13% reading. And this is all age groups. So then when they break it down by age group, who would you say are the biggest readers, age-wise?
Oh, I don't know. Go ahead and tell me.
Older. The older you are, the more you read. And some of that makes sense because retirees have lots of free time on their hand, and they are going to watch a lot. I'm sorry, they're going to read a lot with that time. They also probably grew up with fewer media options, which meant that they had a greater likelihood that they would grow up loving to read as opposed to consuming other media. And so older age groups by far are the dominant readers. 18 to 35-year-olds barely read.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
That was true in 2004, and it's even more true today, with one exception. I think the 18 to 25 age group actually increased between 2004 and 2022. But the problem is it was coming from such a small level to begin with that it only went up a little bit, but it did go up. All of the others have collapsed substantially. And the older age groups have actually shrunk the most in their reading relative to the other age groups. They're still the dominant readers, but they were losing 20% or something like that, 20 percentage points compared to 2004. And clearly they're watching a lot more cable news. They're watching a lot more things on television that, or maybe they're watching more YouTube videos, or maybe they're watching things that aren't reading. And so there's this enormous gender divide that's only getting worse. Elementary school teachers don't know how to deal with that because the students are coming into school basically having grown up in preschool watching short attention span television, watching, where cartoons that are very fast paced, lots of quick cuts, lots of just very frenetic activity, and generally not very verbal. shows. It's more visual rather than verbal. They're playing video games. They're learning certain types of hand-eye coordination and certain types of spatial skills, and they're learning certain types of communication skills that are not reading. And it's very limiting for them. And they've been, their pleasure centers in their brain have been conditioned to want spectacle, to want those adrenaline rushes, to want, all of those endorphins that you get from the kinds of spectacle that, action TV and, video games give you. And books don't deliver that, especially not older books that are more realistic in nature. And, boys apparently don't have the attention span to read. And it's amazing to see how that's playing out, just watching the cohort of students in my daughter's grades as they've grown older and as they've gone from grade to grade to grade. The girls in their classes are far better students than the boys. When the sixth grade honor roll would come out at the end of every semester, there might be, in a grade of, say, 75 students. So 75 students in the grade, there would be, say, 25 honor roll students who were, kind of at that. These are the ones who had those top, A students, really consistently good grades. They were all good. Of those 20 or 25 students, 85 to 90% were girls. Seriously. I mean, it was, okay, you've got 20 girls and 4 boys. Or it's like, what's going on here? I mean, and it was consistent through all of the grades. And there wasn't a huge gender disparity in the makeup of the grades. There was some, especially as you got a little bit older, because what would happen is, and again, this is private Catholic school. So it's not like a public school where they basically have to keep everybody in school. They can't expel anybody easily in a public school. But in a private school, there were a lot more disciplinary problems with the boys. And so over time, a kid that was a problem in first, second, and third grade, by the time they got to 5th grade, the parents were probably asked to not come back, or at least that particular child was said, your child is too disruptive. Your child is impeding the learning experience for his classmates. And it was always a him. It was always a boy. So whereas the gender breakdown in 1st and 2nd grade was roughly equal, by the time you got to 7th and 8th grade, it was 60-40. Wow. Because boys weren't sticking around. Now, some boys were leaving because, well, they wanted to pursue sports. And so in public schools, for example, it was easier to pursue sports. But for the most part, it was the boys were not well equipped to succeed in school in that environment and were being asked to go elsewhere. And that was very gendered. Reading, likewise, as I said, the honor roll, overwhelmingly female. All the top students were girls, with only a very, very few exceptions. Same is true in high school now. At the high school my kids are going to, there are some good students who are boys. Most of them are girls in the high school. And I mean, it really troubles me. It troubles me to, maybe I shouldn't say that. I'm just going to reveal something that my daughters have shared with me, and I probably shouldn't say that. This is who knows who might be watching this. Some of her friends might be watching this, as far as I know. But let's just say it's not the experience that boys and girls, male and female students have in high school today is not at all like the experience I had in high school 40 years ago. And I graduated from high school 40 years ago. And my experience, I'm sure, was very different from that of my own parents. But it seems so incredibly dysfunctional in how boys and girls are learning to interact with one another. There is this clear divergence that's happening between the cohorts of male and female students. And then there's added dimensions that I'm not sure how to interpret. I mean, again, this is a private Catholic high school that they're attending, and there's a rough estimate that approximately 40%, maybe as much as 50% of the students at the school have identified themselves as having some degree of LGBTQ leanings, just, and again, I'm not attaching any kind of a value judgment to that, but it does seem that that's far higher than what biological studies have indicated, which have said that 10%, maybe 15% are biologically inclined to be attracted to same-sex partners than heterosexual. So there's a cultural aspect to this, and I've heard that in some respects it's a bit of a backlash. The girls rejecting the boys. The boys don't know how to talk to them. The boys don't know how to relate to them. The boys are not equals in the eyes of many of the girls. And the girls have said, fine, we'll stick with our own kind. And what does that say to the boys? Well, some of the boys are not very happy about it. And yet they don't know what to do about it. And they get upset. And some of them engage in even worse behavior. Some of the behaviors that the girls are saying, look, we don't like that behavior. But the boys respond by being even worse. Other boys seem to be responding by saying, okay, fine, we'll be more like girls. And are adopting, again, some of the LGBTQ identifiers, even if they actually aren't biologically LGBTQ. And again, I'm not trying to really draw a hard distinction between biological and non-biological. I'm really, and there's no judgment here. I am very comfortable with inclusion and gender choice and sexual identity. That's not the issue here at all. It's how this might actually be caused to some degree, that I have no idea how much, by these cultural influences, the media influences that kids are being exposed to at very young ages, and whether they're reading at very young ages. And boys clearly are not reading at very young ages and not learning how to relate to other people. And it's having a consequence, I think, in the social fabric of growing up.
Yeah, that's really sad to.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go into
No,
a fairly heavy and potentially loaded topic. And again, I'm trying to impose any kind of a judgment on anything related to that. It's more the analytical side of me going, there's got to be a cause here, because
no, I appreciate that you're bringing this up. Yeah.
This wasn't something that was prevalent. And while I'm sure, going to high school in the early 80s, there were people who were gay in my high school, but there weren't a lot who were out of the closet at the time. And there was definitely a stigma that still existed at that point in time. So it was underrepresented, absolutely. But I still have to wonder if there's something else at work here that's driving the difficulty that the genders are having. And even within genders, there's a lot of just difficulty relating to people and understanding them.
Yeah. Well, I'm very fascinated by generation theory, and it's fascinating how that relates to reading and literature. And I guess my big thing is I wish there were more books that were available, especially for
Mhm.
for young male readers, that appeal to young male readers. I think it's very sad that we don't see more of that. That's the one
I
thing that I notice when I go into the YA section, is I just feel like there's not enough there. When I was trying to shop
well,
for my nephew, I was trying to find a good book to give him. There were
how
some, but
old is
not a lot. He's 14, very smart, very, very
he?
smart. He
Okay.
also goes to a private Catholic high school and top of his class, scientist, very
That
science minded.
that is too old for this book. I did pull up a few children's
Ah,
books that I think are great. This was one of my favorites as a kid. It was written, I think, around 1967 or so. It's called The Mad Scientist Club by
ah,
Bertram Brinley. He was actually a rocket scientist in real life, a true rocket scientist, but he wrote a series of books. This is the first in the series about a group of boys just who live in a neighborhood, and they all have a variety of different backgrounds and skills, and they love science and inventing things. But they love science, but it's more how can they use science and kind of basic engineering to do some really clever things that often verge onto the prankster type things. They're harmless pranks, but they're fun pranks, and they're very ingenious and very fun. And I was so excited when I discovered, I mean, probably 15 years ago, that this book had been brought back into print. So this is, um, I don't think it was ever in hardcover when it was first published back in the 60s, but it was published in paperback for a number of years. But what was it? Purple House Press? Yes, Purple House Press, which is a small specialty press, has been putting out some of these classics from the 1960s and 70s that have been lost. They've been out of print for years, and they're wonderful.
yeah.
And you can buy them in hardcover. And I'm plugging this. I have no relationship to Purple House Press. This is me simply gushing over one of my
Mhm.
absolute favorite books. It is written for boys, which is not to say that girls can't enjoy it, but I mean, at the time, back in the 1960s, there was girl fiction and there was boy fiction, and this was clearly being written for boys at that time. And I loved it. I can't imagine boys today not loving it because there is an element of kind of irreverence in it. There's that is consistent with what you find today in modern culture. It's also very clever, and they're using intelligence, critical thinking, very, very cleverly in this book. And it's just kids who are doing it. And they're doing it realistically. It's not like they're all geniuses that are doing these amazing things. It's like, no, they're just using stuff that they find around the house, regular tools, regular supplies, regular materials they can find at their local hardware store or grocery store. And they're doing some pretty fun things with them. And I love these types of books. And you can't find them anymore because the books that are written today that have sort of similar ideas tend to be so spectacle laden. They're so over the top, unrealistic that it's not really giving something for the kids to shoot for. I mean, I read these books as a kid and went, I want to do that. And I actually tried. I got some of my friends together in the neighborhood and said, let's try and do some of these kinds of things and see if we can replicate it. And we could have, but we didn't really follow through as effectively as we should have to actually make it happen. But I don't see a lot of books written for boys today that have that. You end up with superhero books, which are sometimes targeted at girls, which are ridiculous. I mean, there's a book by Shannon Hale. I don't know if you know who Shannon Hale is. I mean, she's the same author who wrote, I think she wrote the Princess Diaries, if I remember correctly,
Oh, okay.
and many others, kind of in that basic genre for girls, typically kind of targeting girl readers. But she was approached by Marvel to write a superhero book
Oh,
about the incredible Squirrel Girl or something like that. I mean, it's about Squirrel Girl. Squirrel Girl is in fact a member of the MCU, sort of. I mean, she's certainly part of the Marvel universe, the pantheon of superheroes. And she is a girl, a teenage girl who happens to have squirrel-like superpowers and a bushy tail. And she's bizarre, but in some respects, she's the single most powerful superhero in the entire Marvel universe, despite the fact that she doesn't actually have much in the way of superpowers. But she's the only superhero who's actually defeated some of the most powerful villains in the universe in her storylines that she's had in comic books. I don't read those, but I'm familiar with it because in the book club that I had at my kids' middle school, we read the Unbelievable Squirrel Girl, or again, I can't think of the exact name. Meg Cabot wrote Princess Diaries. Shannon Hale wrote something else that's very much like the Princess Diaries. And I don't remember what it is. Okay, thank you, Evie. But anyway, this book is so bad in that it is, again, so over the top, so focused on spectacle, so short in character development, so short in making, providing really useful role models and useful lessons for readers. It's all about, hey, can I get those endorphins flowing? And make you, if it makes you enjoy reading, that's great. It's wonderful. But is it then conditioning them to only want to read those types of things and avoid the granola? They're eating their sugar snacks and not eating the granola. Sometimes you got to eat your vegetables to have a greater appreciation of reading. My curmudgeon-y side is probably starting to show at this point. I try not to let it show, but it sometimes does come out.
Well, it's wonderful that we have so many great books available in fantasy these days. I know you were talking about that with Jimmy about being in the golden age of fantasy, because there's a lot of good stuff out there. And I love how you're bringing so much attention to it on your channel and talking about so many wonderful influences in the genres. So
yeah, it's probably getting close time to wrap up.
Yeah, I think we're going to go ahead.
I mean, look at this. We're at 3.5 hours.
I know.
I didn't realize we've been going that long. I apologize. I'm so long-winded.
And I'm sorry
I'm
because I did
people
not
have stuck around.
And I'm sorry that I couldn't get to every single question in the chat. I did have some wonderful questions here highlighted by Evie, but I'll just go ahead and read these really quickly, if you don't mind, in the last minute here.
Sure.
I've always appreciated the analytical aspect of Bridger's videos. I often disagree with some of his claims, but he actually makes arguments with evidence, and that facilitates real discussion. So
that's great. That's all I'm trying to do. I don't expect everybody to agree with me. In fact, I'm not saying that I'm always right. And a lot of times I present things like, this is what I think, but I might be wrong. There are other ways of looking at this. And thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. Oh, we had I think I remembered that.
Disagreement on G2K
is overstating it, but I think we did. If I remember the exchange, was this the exchange over defining what is fantasy and what is not? And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But I do remember a very, very interesting exchange of viewpoints, and I really enjoyed that exchange of comments on that video.
Yeah. And then last year, Heidi said, Bridger, I asked earlier if you had read Deathstalker. I did see the question.
I have not read Deathstalker. I have sampled Green. I'm trying to think of the other series that he wrote. The name of it is escaping me. But I mean, I did read the first book in that other series just to get a sense of, who he was and the kinds of books that he wrote. I did enjoy it and look forward to reading more Green in the future.
Oh, and Evie had a question here. I'm sorry I missed this, Evie. To clarify your previous statement, Bridget, are you saying there cannot be a female?
Absolutely. I'm being a gatekeeper here. I wouldn't.
Actually, a superhero squirrel, right? A squirrel woman?
I'm merely saying that the way it was written, and there are male superheroes that are being written the same way. It's about the spectacle. It really wasn't about gender that I was highlighting there. I think you're just sort of poking me here, Evie, to be a little bit of a troll. And so, but I'm not at all trying to make any kind of broad judgments or characterizations of gender representation in children's literature or other literature. But I do think that teachers need to do things a little differently to get boys to read more. And I think they need to be a lot more hands-on, and they need to help them experience stories in different ways. And in fact, going back to the earlier discussion we have, and I don't want to prolong this, where we were talking about different literacy teaching methods, the pedagogy of phonics versus whole language and whatnot. The thing that they've discovered is that the method that seems to work best, not perfectly, but most effectively, is a very specialized method that was developed for dyslexic students. That what works for dyslexic students should work for everyone, or very close to everyone.
Okay.
And so but it's a very, very focused, structured method that involves a lot more attention from the teachers and a lot more purpose and careful thought in how these things are taught to students. And many teachers just haven't been taught how to do that well. And there's going to need to be a fair amount of in-service teacher training to make that happen.
Sounds like it. Well, Bridger, it has been such a pleasure to talk with you. These 3 hours and 40 minutes have just flown by. And I really hope to continue the conversation with you sometime, because I had such a great time. And I still feel like there's so much more I could ask you, honestly. So thank you so much for being such a wonderful guest.
Well, thank you. I have enjoyed it. I'd love to continue this conversation in whatever forum you think would work best.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.